Bob Woodward, as we begin, let me start with sort of a big picture question for you. It's been 30 years now that you have been looking at the applications of power in modern America. Do you think Americans in the latter part of the 20th century and the early part of the 21st are well served by their government?
Sometimes, yes, and obviously, going back to Watergate, not the case. Had a criminal president, but from my point of view as a journalist, author, the goal is to kind of defeat secret government, to kind of say, look, this is what's going on, this is what they're really saying to each other, this is what they're really doing, and sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not.
Why in a democracy does it seem to be the nature of government to want to act in secret?
It's in the nature of human nature to want to act in secret. People always do, groups of people do. Certainly in a time of war, there are reasons for secrets. It gets out of hand often. And what I find interesting about this President Bush is, though they've done a fabulous job of walling him off and keeping him away from people who want to examine what goes on, because I was able to spend over a year on this, really, and get a little piece here and a little piece there. At some point, they kind of decided, okay, the story's going to be told, and I was able to get the kind of detail that normally comes out 20 or 30 years down the road.
I want to welcome our Book TV viewers to our 3-hour conversation with Bob Woodward, and we are going to be talking for about 15 minutes and then inviting you into the process. Let me give you the telephone numbers now so that as your questions come to mind, you can begin dialing and get in the queue and be part of the conversation. If you're watching us in the eastern half of the United States, it's 202-585-3880. If you're out west, the Pacific or Western time zones, 202-585-3881. Going back to presidential leadership, describe, because that was really your whole mission with the latest book, describe George W. Bush's leadership style.
He operates by gut, in instinct, but it's not that he just kind of picks the green one off the shelf. It's that he listens and then kind of takes his measure of people. I think ultimately in foreign affairs and the war on terrorism, he's a very practical person. That when Colin Powell came to him and said, you know, you can't go to war against Iraq alone by yourself, you need allies and friends, and laid out the reasons in a very compelling way, President Bush essentially in the last several months shifted his whole Iraq policy, and we're working through the UN instead of going to war by ourselves.
Reading your book, I kept thinking back to themes from the 2000 campaign and some of the most often repeated slogans from Bush as candidate, including uniter, not a divider, talking about humility. Very often during the debates that theme came up. Are these trends evident in the President Bush that you saw, or did September 11th change those themes?
Well, it obviously changed to them. There's nothing humble about Bush's foreign war policy. We have declared war against the terrorists, and he's willing to use lethal force with the military and with the CIA regularly. You can't say that's humble. His assessment, again, my point is that he's very practical. Look, we've been attacked. We need to respond. In fact, the terrorists have such leverage in this country in terms of going against an open democracy that we are going to essentially have to eliminate them completely in order to be safe.
As you go through the book and the points where your interviews with President George W. Bush were evident, so frequently the sentences began with, "My job is," "My role is," to the point where I almost was beginning to track them. Talk to the audience a little bit about how President Bush developed that view, and when you went back and looked at the times that he talked about "my job is, my role," were they cohesive or did they sometimes conflict?
Well, it's an interesting question. What I did with him is send him a 20-page memo last summer and said, this is the chronology I have of major turning points, decision points for you, where in the secret deliberations, I understand you had these reactions, these things to say. And so each time it's different. And for instance, in a couple of weeks after the 9/11 attacks, he decided, again based on instinct, he said, that it was time to start the bombing of Afghanistan, to, in a sense, put one up on the board for the United States. And I said, you know, the obvious question, why? And his answer was, well, I had this feeling that people were kind of out there saying, when are we going to, where is he? Meaning Bush. When is he going to act? When is he going to do something? And he so then came to an NSC meeting and said, okay, are we going to be ready to go next Monday or Tuesday? This was on a Wednesday, September 26th. And he said, I'll decide on Friday. And everyone was quite surprised that he wanted to start that early. And he then talked with Condi Rice, his national security advisor, and said, hey, why am I going to hear what I want to hear on Friday? Are we ready? And she said, well, I'm not exactly sure they're ready, and there's some hesitation. And he really exploded and said, that's unacceptable. Why aren't we ready? And literally chased her down by phone from one place to the next. Then when they met, he said, okay, took the pressure off and said, when are we going to be ready to go? Turned out it was a week later than he initially hoped. But what, in asking him, well, you know, why all this fire? Why? He said instinct. But then he maintained that his job was to be provocative, that he had to come in there and provoke people and surprise them a little bit. Did you tell the people this was kind of a provocation session? No, I didn't. He said, my job is my responsibility to do that, and I don't have to explain myself in secret to the War Cabinet why I'm doing that. So each phase of this over the last year, you see him responding in a very different and specific way.
Because you had the chance to look at the Clinton administration also in its early days, would you talk about the way that President Bush's cabinet sees him as a leader compared with President Clinton's cabinet and how they viewed him as a leader?
That's a really serious and important question, and I've never really sat down and done a line-by-line comparison or incident-by-incident comparison. In general, Clinton was always debating, as we always called it, late night at the dorm. It would go on and on and on, and he might decide, and then somebody would come in and say, well, now wait a minute, I think you need to look at this, you need to consider this angle, and then he would undecide, and then he would redecide. In a sense, things were always open for discussion, and almost they could be reopened at any moment. In the case of Bush, he tends to listen, though one of the points he made, he said that he tends to be a bit of a gas bag at these meetings himself and talks on and on more than he should. And then once he kind of gets his feel of where he's going, the door closes and he decides and expects everyone to fall in line and then proceed. So there is not the doubt, not the re-examination. Clinton had all of the benefits and handicaps of an intellectual, of almost an academic, someone who could see all sides of the argument. In the case of Bush, he wants to see, well, what's the solution? How do we fix it? He'll weigh him, and then that's where he goes.
Let's go from style to particulars. In the case of pursuing Osama bin Laden, you describe how the Bush cabinet was, and this is, I think, an exact word, derisive of the Clinton approach. And they called it pounding sand, sending cruise missiles to tents. Would you talk a little bit more about the objectives of the one administration versus the other with regard to bin Laden?
Well, in fairness to Clinton, he didn't have 9/11 to contend with. He had some bombings of embassies in East Africa in '98, which were big, devastating events, but didn't kill thousands of Americans. In fact, did not kill hundreds of Americans. So the feeling was this was an offshore problem. And though there were covert operations launched through the CIA and discussions of using a small military operation, they never got bin Laden. Significantly, in the case of Bush, in his first 9 or 10 months, he did not have a new program in place to go after bin Laden aggressively. He had been warned by CIA Director Tenet, and I lay out this secrets briefing that they gave President-elect Bush, and Tenet and his operations chief, James Pavitt, said to the president-elect, there are 3 things you have to worry about. One of them's bin Laden, that his threat is tremendous and immediate. The other was China, and the other was proliferations of weapons of mass destruction. They had a program, the White House, the Bush White House feels they did enough, but they didn't have it in place on 9/11.
Recalling some of the conversations around the planning tables that you reported upon, especially in the months immediately after September 11th, would there have been any room in the thinking at that time for 15 months later Osama bin Laden not being caught?
Well, they obviously thought they could get him, and it was a goal. It was an enunciated goal. As you may recall, Bush said emphatically and repeatedly, dead or alive, we want him. They realized they weren't going to be able to get him, and they're quite right in saying the problem is much bigger than bin Laden, but he's a symbol, and if you can decapitate the leader of a terrorist organization, it has an impact, and they have not done it.
Because we're poised with inspectors in Iraq now, you deal a lot with, again, the early conversations and in your epilogue with more recent conversations about Saddam Hussein. Would you tell our viewers about how early on Saddam Hussein came into play in the post-September 11th conversations?
Well, just for the context, it came into play before 9/11 with Bush. In the Pentagon particularly, they were trying to develop military plans to go after and depose Saddam Hussein. And they never got very far. And then 9/11, on 9/11, Secretary Rumsfeld said, maybe we should use this as an opportunity to go after Saddam. And it was on the table for a few days, and then Bush, about 4 days after 9/11, ruled it out, said the first wave in the attack against terrorism is not going to include Iraq. But then this year it went back on the table, and of course we're where we are now, where Saddam is presumably public enemy #1 for Bush and his administration, though the tactics shifted from thinking of unilateral action to working through the UN.
And with regard to connectivity, one of the quotes I wrote down, page 99 in your book, this is from President Bush: I believe Iraq was involved in 9/11, but I don't have the evidence yet.
That holds today. I think they
It's
believe,
a gut again.
yeah, again, the gut, and the CIA director, George Tenet, has told Bush that when terrorist investigations go on for years and years, and often you don't get the real answer in the first year or 2 or even 3 or 4. Things have to get flushed out. And Tenet has told Bush something that truly fascinated me, that when we get done with this, we will find Iranian mood music, meaning the Iranians somehow indirectly involved, and the Iraqis indirectly involved. Iraqi mood music, as Tenet put it, meaning that there would be financing or some individual or providing cover or hiding places or passports or communications capability from one terrorist group to to another.
I want to involve our audience, our viewers in this. I should tell folks that our goal here with In Depth is not just to talk about the current book. And of course, I know those of you watching have seen Mr. Woodward on a number of interview programs talking about this, so you're familiar with many of the news stories that have come out. But we have the luxury in this time of also looking back over his writing career, and we've got the 11 previous books here, including the one that started it all the President's Men back in 1974, all the way through to his portrait of Alan Greenspan called Maestro, which was his most current book. And so all of those are on the table as we go to your calls in just a minute or so. We can begin taking some calls now if our producer will do that. Across the board, and it seems like way back in 1974, a Bob Woodward style was pretty evident, which was a cast of characters at the beginning for the readers to give a playlist of who's who, and the reporting of conversations. Where did this style develop?
Well, the goal is to construct a narrative, a story, because people live their lives as stories. We communicate through stories, and so I don't think in terms of chapters. I think of time moving on, and conversations are the essence. And in going back to Watergate, it was the Nixon conversations that we now know about on the tapes that provide the best. There's a kind of evidentiary purity in those tapes. So if you can find out what was said, there is a fascinating, very good review of Michael Beschloss's book on Roosevelt and Truman called The Conquerors. The review is in the New York Times today. And the reviewer, Tom Powers, says what Beschloss has done going back 50 years is it's a history of what was spoken at the time. And if you can get close to what is spoken at the time, also what the memos and the communications are, but presidencies are run orally by and large, because there are lots of things on the plate. They have meetings, people run in and out. If you can get that, it gives you the best slice of the reality.
What's going to be the net effect on people trying to do your job or historians in the future, given President Bush's executive order about presidential papers?
Well, I would hope that they would reconsider that order. I think it burying the paperwork. In fact, at one point, President Bush says in one of these secret meetings, we're going to have to not put anything on paper. We have to worry about leaks. They do put a lot of things on paper, but not enough. And I think they should not go to war with history on this. In my research, particularly in the case of Bush, he was willing to sit for 2.5 hours, answer almost 300 questions about exactly what happened, why he did things, how he felt about it, who he was listening to, where the ideas in theory of managing and governing came from, as it related to his father's presidency and his own instincts and tendencies. Now that is the kind of look at somebody's decision-making that you normally don't get. So I would hope down the road, optimistically, they're going to say, yes, we need to let the history speak.
Our first viewer call is from Tampa, Florida. You're on the air.
Yes, this is Dean Chambers calling from Tampa, Florida.
Hi.
Mr. Woodward, it's an honor to speak to you, sir. In fact, a couple of weeks ago, I got to call into Larry King and ask you about the relationship between George Bush Sr. and Jr. Today, I'd like to ask you about the war on terrorism. With September 11th and the fact that 15 of the 19 hijackers were from Saudi Arabia, and they've had a history of actually terrorism as far as funding it. Sir, what is your thoughts on that as far as why are we going after a country such as Afghanistan when countries such as Saudi Arabia seem to be only now just recently coming up on the radar? Are they truly an ally, or is it one of those cases where, you know, with allies like that, who needs enemies?
Okay, well, it's a good question, because there's been much out there about the Saudi money and the Saudi money going to some of these charities, and charities funding terrorism or terrorist organizations. So if you look at it and go into it in depth, I think you would find that the Saudis, in terms of fighting terrorism are really our allies, and in a very significant way, and have helped in this way. At the same time, they have monumental problems at home. They have their own terrorist problems. They have al-Qaeda cells in Saudi Arabia, and so to go after them like we did Afghanistan would make no sense at all. There is no, the Saudi government, whatever its weaknesses may be, and there are innumerable weaknesses, is fighting terrorism at home. In Afghanistan, the Taliban was not fighting bin Laden. In fact, they made Afghanistan a sanctuary for him so he could have all of these terrorist training camps.
Two quick follow-ups. In fact, in your book, you reported that it is the Saudi government's view that it was a strategic decision by Osama bin Laden to have so many of the hijackers come from Saudi Arabia as a way to form a rift between the two countries.
Well, and to stick it to the Saudis, I think that's one of the factors here. But there is no question that there are a group of Saudis who are abroad or in Saudi Arabia who are highly radicalized and want to overthrow the Saudi monarchy and want to destroy America. So in a sense, we have an alliance, a very real overlap of interests with the Saudis. The Saudi government is, to say the least, not a democracy, and there are people who raise very legitimate questions about how we deal with them and why we deal with them. But the history of warfare, unfortunately, you have to make your allies where you can find them. And during World War II, the living, most powerful example, we made alliance with the Soviet Union. And in fact, the Soviet Union, in many ways, defeated Hitler. And without that alliance, Hitler would have triumphed. So you have to say, if they'll be on our side in the big fight, we have to join with them. That does not mean that we embrace their form of government.
And further, in a section where you talk about Algeria, you report that once the understanding of the influence of al-Qaeda in Algeria was known, it doubled the list of known al-Qaeda members that the CIA was looking at. Why do we hear so little of that?
It's a good question, but this was a number of years ago, and they found some Algerian connections after the Millennium Plots were exposed, and the man arrested, Rassam, was Algerian, so they started looking at Algeria, and they realized their al-Qaeda activities and cells there, and it literally, as you pointed out, doubled the number that we knew about. Algeria is in alliance with the United States, as many countries are in the Middle East and Africa, fighting this secret war. There's a whole war going on, that there are battles won and lost that don't make the newspapers, that we never find out about. The CIA and foreign intelligence services have literally arrested thousands, not hundreds, but thousands of people abroad who are terrorists or believed to have terrorist connections.
San Jose, California, you're on for Bob Woodward.
Yeah, hi Susan, hi Bob. I guess I'm on again. You were on last time, and I asked you about doing an expose of the powers that be, which I think needs to be done still, because a lot of minor stories are covered far more importantly than major stories. There is a news station out here which is posing this battle that we are having of civilizations, so to speak.
By the powers that be, you mean the media organizations?
You know, like unimportant stories like Monica Lewinsky's are covered, and important stories like surgical terror and state terror versus, you know, Al-Qaeda terror
Your question?
are covered in a way. My question is essentially this. First of all, why isn't I'm lost for a moment. My first question is that Walter Cronkite was on a couple of days ago, and he said that Deep Throat was a figment of yours and Mr. Bradley's imagination, and I would like to find out if that is true or not.
That is not true. Deep Throat was one person who will be identified when he dies or allows me to identify him.
Hopkinsville, Kentucky.
Yes, sir. I just wanted to ask a question. I'm a young political science major in college still, and I wanted to just say, why should young people of my age be interested in, learning about Watergate and the legacy that was left behind by you and Mr. Bernstein?
Well, obviously it's your choice if you want to learn about it. It is part of American history, and I guess the theme that emerged from the Nixon-Watergate era is this abuse of power, this massive abuse of power by the president, operating in secret, essentially deciding that the government should be almost a personal instrument of revenge. We use the CIA, the FBI, the Secret Service, you name it. If you are ever interested, go listen to some of the Nixon tapes, and I think you will be shocked, if not frightened, that there was a president there who did not have the view what would be right or what would be good for the country.
With 12 books to your name now, and these books appearing every 3 to 4 years, one can begin to see the intersections in your stories. Let me go to The Shadow and have you talk about, this book was, in fact, the influence of Watergate on the succeeding presidencies. George W. Bush still influenced by Watergate, or is he the first president to have escaped the influence of Watergate?
Well, that's a good question. He's not pictured there, and we haven't had a major Bush scandal yet. What is interesting is how this President Bush was influenced and has been influenced by his father's presidency. And one of the things Bush Sr., when he was president, would say frequently, or almost talk about derisively, was the vision, or the vision thing, that being president is more of an operational role and responsibility, and not something where you need an umbrella thought or a concept. You don't need the vision thing. Bush, when I talked to him, this president, just volunteered out of the blue, said, one of the things I learned is the vision thing matters. That you have to have a concept and an idea. It is not just the day-to-day managing of the government. In terms of Watergate, in terms of scandals, I don't know.
Or prevention of scandals?
Prevention of scandals. Well, one of the interesting things about this President Bush is, though there is a lot of secrecy in his administration that people have criticized, when I went about this task of trying to say, well, what happened in the war? What happened on the 23rd? What happened in this meeting? What's the relationship with Powell and Cheney and Condi Rice and Don Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense, and not being interested in what's going to happen tomorrow or what happened exactly this day? They had a feeling, and the president had a feeling, okay, we will answer, we will deal with it, we will not hide. When I interviewed Bush for hours, there was no restriction on questions. There was no pushback. There was no, when we got into rather sensitive or secret matters, the curtain didn't drop down. It was more, let's explore this. If I would ask, I need your inner thought on that more, he would say, let's go for it. And so this is a man on these issues, not concealing and not hiding. Point of view of a journalist, that's critical. And I got records, have known people for years or even longer that I was able to check things with and say, is this really what happened? Is this the full story? Is there something being left out here? And as best I can tell, there is not. There are some secret operations which I did not find out about, which I wish I did but did not. But in terms of the overall, This is not a concealment operation. This is not a presidency based on what I know at this point. Now, I could miss things, or it could change. It is not a presidency being run as some sort of conspiracy of silence.
Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, you're next, and you're on the air.
Yes, Bob, I have a question. I'm an airline employee, and I've seen thousands of layoffs as far as these good union. I have a good union job, but we are now having to pay for health insurance as of January, and more cuts along the way.
You have one tough job. I'm aware of that, and anyone listening would be aware of it too.
And also, as living out in the Pacific Northwest, I've seen Boeing pull out and go down to the South where they don't have to pay union wages. My question is, who really profits from this war? What companies and what percentage really goes to the help? Because we're the taxpayers. Who's going to pay for this war, and who profits?
Well, the taxpayers are definitely going to pay, and that's a really good question. Obviously, some of the defense industries are going to profit from it. Some of the security people and security operations are going to profit from it. But we're at a sufficiently early stage that I don't think you can get a full handle on that with names of companies and individuals. Down the road, that will be something that people are going to be able to answer completely.
Would it be fair to say that most members of Congress who read your book would not be happy with the administration's outreach or thinking about them? Would you talk a little bit about the relationship?
Oh, you mean about the attitude toward Congress? I don't know. I mean, there isn't a whole lot about Congress there.
I'm thinking about the Nick Callio story.
Oh, yes, where Bush wanted to clamp down access to secrets. He really blew up about that and put out a memo saying only the top 8 leaders in both houses and the heads of the intelligence committees would have access to secrets. They negotiated a very long, cumbersome negotiation, which is quite interesting, and Bush finally withdrew that order. Again, it's a case of him getting on fire when something happened. It happened to be a story, as best I can tell, that I wrote with Susan Schmidt at the Washington Post, and it had some things from secret briefings, and he closed it down. That was his practical solution. I think he realized it was the wrong solution, that you have to deal with Congress, that Congress cannot function without access to secrets, and so he withdrew the memo.
But you were about to say, and I interrupted you, that there's not much of Congress in the book. Is that in itself telling? I mean, Congress is ultimately the decision maker with the government going to war.
No, it's not, in fact. It says in the Constitution that Congress has the power to declare war, but particularly during the 20th century, when it was quite clear that the president, as commander-in-chief, had the power to employ the forces as he saw fit. Presidents have gone for the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, or Bush's father for the Gulf War resolution supporting the Gulf War, or this president going to Congress and asking for a resolution of support to go to war with Iraq if necessary. I think most lawyers reading the Constitution will say the president's the commander-in-chief. He can do what he deems necessary. The only power the Congress has is to withdraw funds for the war, and that would be very hard to do once a president has committed men and women to battle, for the Congress to come and say, okay, we're taking away the money so they won't have ammunition, so they won't get paid, so they won't have food. I mean, it would be unprecedented for something like that to happen. At the same time, there is a recognition that there needs to be some sort of consultation, but the power to use the military, certainly the power to use the CIA, which plays a significant role in all of this, is in the president's hands. And I think it underscores a point that when this country elects a president, you give that president the power to do all kinds of things, both good and bad, and the selection of that person is absolutely critical. Congress can monitor it. Congress can suggest alternatives. Congress can consult. Ultimately, Congress can withdraw money. There's nothing in the Constitution where they can undeclare war. And perhaps in this age, somehow something is going to have to be done with that. If Bush does well on this war, things will probably be fine. But if it turns out that things do not go well, then Congress and the public is rightly going to say, hey, wait a minute, what is the check and balance to presidential authority here?
Next call for Bob Woodward, Lakeland, Florida. Go ahead, please.
Yes, Mr. Woodward, I would like to commend you. I'm Dr. Bert Henry of Boiling Springs, Pennsylvania. I happen to be in Lakeland. But commend you and Mr. Carl Bernstein for the watershed journalism that you did during the Watergate era. A tremendous piece of work. And I would like to commend to you that Melvin Laird, the representative, ex-representative, and Secretary of Defense of Richard Nixon, who I think may have been your deep throat, should certainly have recognition during his lifetime for the courageous patriotism that he was able to exhibit during that era. And I hope he will reconsider his agreement with you.
That's an interesting way to get you
to comment on it. I'll tell you, there have been so many people put on and off the list as possible deep throat candidates. The list does narrow. And so I've just decided over the last year not to comment on speculation about who may or may not be that source.
In rereading All the President's Men, would you tell the story of how the moniker Deep Throat came about?
The managing editor of the Washington Post at the time, Howard Simons, a great editor and newspaper man and prodder of Carl and myself, saying, where is the story going? Get out there, get more answers. We were talking about the source whom I was meeting in an underground garage, and the basis of the discussion was deep background. And that meant we could use the material but not attribute it to a specific source. And Howard was just sitting there and said, oh, the garage guy, you know, deep background, deep throat. And the name stuck.
I think there was a movie around that time of a similar name as well.
Yes, there was a pornographic movie with Linda Lovelace.
Next call for you is from San Jose, California.
Yeah, thank you very much. You read my mind there. I was going to mention the movie. Bob, the president got elected.
Sir, I'm going to let you go because one time in the program, it's the gentleman who called us earlier.
Oh, okay.
Let other people have their opportunity to participate. Let's move on to Atlanta. Go ahead.
Yeah, my question is this, after September 11, Bush made a statement that everybody in the world heard about, that any country that supports terrorists, how about terrorists, that he's going after. And then we saw that Pakistan, which we regard as our friend, had a terrorist group that went over to India, and so many of the politicians were killed. We saw that America did not do anything. What about that?
Okay, well, that's a good question. When Bush talked about terrorists and harboring terrorists, I think the focus was on terrorist groups that strike the United States, and we operate in Pakistan through the intelligence services, through our CIA, and all kinds of people have been apprehended who are al-Qaeda terrorists in Pakistan.
Speaking of the CIA, your book, The Veil, which I'll find in the lineup here, told the story of what about the CIA? What's the bottom line?
Well, this was Casey's time as CIA director under Reagan, and it's the secret wars of 6 years of Casey operating, and eventually going off the books, as it was called, and not having the CIA do some of the dirty operations, but having Oliver North and the National Security Council and supporting the Contras, trading arms for hostages, and ultimately Casey being involved in an assassination attempt that was unsuccessful against a terrorist leader, Sheikh Fadlallah, the Party of God, Hezbollah, in Lebanon.
My point for bringing it up in the current context is you tell the story of the unleashed CIA.
In Bush at war now, yes.
Yes, in current times. Thinking outside the box, the Directorate of Operations back in business again. And of course, we've heard the reporting about Gary, the CIA operative, going over with $3 million in cash to Afghanistan. What kind of checks are in the system so that the war on terrorism doesn't lead to veil?
Yeah, that's a splendid question. And the answer is twofold. First of all, realistically speaking, there was such urgency to get the CIA moving against bin Laden and al-Qaeda after 9/11 that President Bush signed an order, probably the most expansive order ever given to the CIA, to go destroy the terrorists, to use the Predator, which is the drone that has a missile firing capability, to round up people, to do to dispense. That $3 million is just the beginning of the story of the amount of money they're dispensing. The answer is CIA internal controls and the National Security Council overseeing specific operations, but there's no guarantee, as is always the case with the CIA or the military, that they will not go too far. And the urgency here is Roman numeral 1, and oversight and making sure that all the rules are followed is Roman numeral number 2, and I think we're still in a Roman numeral 1 phase.
Next, Phoenix, Arizona.
Good morning. This is Jim Bassell.
Uh-huh.
Bob, I noticed that right at the anniversary of 9/11, that there was a lot of orchestration going on just prior to the UN meeting, the Predator drone being announced and showing what it could do and so on. I came to kind of a conclusion at this time that George W. is a hell of a poker player. Do you have any feeling, or does he have a reputation in Washington circles as the guy that walks away with the chips?
What's that mean, sir?
That he's a good poker player, that he knows how to play the game.
That he bluffs, I think is the suggestion here. I don't think he bluffs. And it is now we are in the phase of the confrontation with Iraq. My judgment is there's no doubt he'll pull the trigger if necessary. He'll go to war. He'd rather not, as he has said, but there is a restlessness to him. There is a sense of, let's fix this, let's get it done. That means there is only a certain amount of patience. I didn't know him as a poker player, but his wife, when I talked to Mrs. Bush, she said they had a group of friends coming from Texas a couple of times after 9/11, and it was going to be a poker reunion in the White House, and the women were going to go to the Kennedy Center. I did not know that Bush played poker or had a poker group. I think he's using all tools available on this. I think and there may be an element of bluff at certain times, but like a good poker player, I suspect he knows if your bluff is called, you have to be willing to show and deliver.
Wayne, Pennsylvania, welcome to the conversation with Bob Woodward.
Yes, good morning, Ms. Wayne. Mr. Woodward, recently Bob Casey Jr., the Auditor General of Pennsylvania, released a report concerning Governor Ridge and a school acquisition in the Philadelphia School District. The report states that Governor Ridge did not necessarily reveal that the Edison Company was the only company to have access to a contract for a school takeover in Philadelphia. I have some concerns. Do you know why George Bush chose Governor Ridge as the chief of a $40 billion budget, the Homeland Security chief? And has the Washington Post had the ability to research Governor Ridge and whether or not he would be a candidate who would subsequently allocate appropriations faithfully and dutifully throughout the nation concerning Homeland Security funds at a $40 billion rate? I thank you for your time, sir.
Good question, and I confess I don't know anything about it. And certainly Governor Ridge was close to Bush when both governors, Ridge governor of Pennsylvania and Bush governor of Texas. It's something to look into, and I don't know that there's any merit or not, but that is not the first person in a call or an email or a letter who suggested that Ridge's background should be examined fully, which it should.
Wolf Creek, West Virginia. Good afternoon to you.
Hello, Mr. Woodward. I have a question here. Revolves around extraordinary circumstances often call for extraordinary sacrifices, and we've had so much discussion on our Homeland Security, and so much of the tension in the world seems to focus around oil. Why haven't we had even a part of the debate? Why hasn't there been any appetite to consider conservation as a way to lower our dependence on foreign oil?
It's a good question, and a lot of people have argued that that's something that should be done. But if you go back to the oil crisis in the 70s, there has just been an unwillingness to really think about energy dependence, which obviously is one of the vulnerabilities the country has.
How much thinking about, we're getting a number of questions about policy. How much thinking about policy do you do?
In what sense?
Well, in your job, your job at the Post is in investigations. Your books are often about politics and tactics, less so perhaps delving into rationales or arguments of one policy versus another, like this oil policy. Is this the kind of thing that you interests you, or do you read and follow debates over policy?
Yes. In fact, all of these debates are about policy. Mm-hmm. The book Bush at War is beginning on 9/11, what happened in the last year, what they did, what the debate is. Can we get assistance here for this policy to operate in Afghanistan, to potentially operate in Iraq, to operate in the Philippines, to operate in Indonesia, and so forth. So it's all about policy.
Sure, macro.
Ultimately, well, but macro, and it gets pretty micro real fast, where the president and his advisors have to sit around and say, how do we get combat search and rescue aircraft from one neighboring country in Afghanistan so we can start the bombing? And they spend days on the details of this. And the chairman of the Joint Chiefs is giving a report. It takes this kind of plane, this many hours to get in. We need 67 deliveries from transport aircraft in the Air Force to get the full combat search and rescue up and running and capable. So is that policy? Yes, because from that hinges on the issue of when we might attack, how we might do it, what its sequencing might be, and so forth. So this is policy in real time. It's not about a debate on a national security strategy. Should this be in paragraph 6 or on the 3rd page or the 19th page? It's a president and his team confronted with a very real-world problem of an attack on this country like we've never had before.
Marina, California.
Yes, I'm a 32-year-old African-American soldier and a listed soldier at that, and I wanted to tell Mr. Woodward that his admirers are just as diverse as our country, and I for one, even though I am so young during the Nixon administration and the aftermath of that I for one respect him, and there are a lot of African-Americans and a lot of people in our country who appreciate his work. I have 3 questions for him. The first question is, we had heard initially after 9/11 that there was a possibility for the Europeans to replace the soldiers, the American soldiers in Bosnia and Kosovo. Have you heard anything on that? Because I haven't heard anything since the initial ending of the aftermath of Ground Zero.
Okay, I think we'll do 2 questions. I mean, the answer to that is there's been discussion of it. I don't think there's been any final decision on that, and if I'm wrong on that, it's because I'm not up to date. I'm sorry.
What's your second?
The second question is, we initially heard after 9/11, during the aftermath, that they were looking for the flight deck recorders, the black boxes of the 2 planes that hit the Twin Towers. Have we heard anything since that time, and is it just never going to happen as far as actually finding those boxes now?
That's a good question, and as best I understand, they were totally destroyed. I mean, the temperatures in that inferno when the planes attacked, struck the building, that everything just disintegrated, including those boxes.
Will you talk a little bit about Condoleezza Rice's role in the Bush White House?
As the National Security Advisor, turns out she is Bush's troubleshooter. She is not somebody like Henry Kissinger who had theories and ideas and a structure she wanted to impose on what should be done in foreign policy. So she acts as, I think, the neutral broker between the president and his advisors. She spends an immense amount of time with Bush, takes his temperature, talks to Rumsfeld, Powell, Tenet, Cheney, the vice president, and then we'll carry back to the president, as I outline in the book, some very dramatic moments where she comes in and says to the president early after the bombing of Afghanistan began, the mood is not good in the War Cabinet among your principal advisors. Are we on the right track? And that sets in motion a debate and finally a decision by the president. But she is the one who carries this back and forth. She is the one, when Colin Powell wanted to talk to the president alone about Iraq policy and outline the reasons why the United States could not go to war with Iraq alone and the consequences of such a war. He set it up through Condi Rice. It was a dinner. She was there. She is there in the private meetings the president has one-on-one with cabinet members in the national security area. She goes to Camp David, goes to Crawford, to the ranch with the president most of the time, has no family, as best I can tell, little or no personal life, is totally devoted. So she's on duty all the time, and there are always things coming in, intelligence or information from the Pentagon or the CIA, and she coordinates it and then decides, I need to present this to the president, I need to let the War Cabinet know that the president thinks this, or we're going to meet at this time on this issue.
As you describe it in the book, it seems a very important information flow role and a very personal role with the president. During the campaign, as I recall, however, with her academic background, she was a briefer to candidate Bush on foreign policy issues. Has she sublimated her world view in this function? You said she doesn't bring a particular Henry Kissinger-like view of the world to the role.
Well, she wasn't just a briefer during the campaign. She was his chief foreign policy advisor.
I mean, she had this long academic background in foreign affairs. And
had worked in the White House, was the Russian expert on the National Security Council staff under Bush's father. I don't know that it's sublimated. It's there. It enters into the discussion. I suspect academics looking at how she functions here will say, gee, she's doing exactly what you're supposed to do. National Security Advisor is coordinator, is troubleshooter, as you suggest, the person who's kind of the communication central on these issues, but somebody not leaning hard on one side of the bar and saying, oh yes, this is the way we have to do it, or this is the way we should not do it.
Next call is Santa Barbara. Welcome to the program.
Yes, hi. Mr. Woodward, we're getting, we're going into Iraq. We're doing all this stuff with the UN inspectors. And then last week we find out that North Korea has just admitted that they have nuclear weapons. And how is President Bush going to balance this double standard of going into Iraq with not sure if they even have nuclear weapons, and yet maintaining a policy of diplomacy towards North Korea, who has just admitted that they have nuclear weapons?
There is an inconsistency there, and it's one that needs to be addressed. In a practical sense, if you look at Saddam Hussein in Iraq, we know that he is willing to attack another country, as he did when he took over Kuwait in 1990. He, at least based on the available intelligence, could be argued he is a package of psychiatric disorders, the likes of which have never been seen before in a leader in the country. There are problems in North Korea. They're very serious. When I asked Bush about this, he actually got quite exercised and waved his finger and said, I loathe Kim Jong-il, the leader of North Korea, because of what Kim Jong-il is doing to his people, starving people, torturing people, breaking up families. And Bush laid out a whole humanitarian component to his view, his vision thing about what should be done in the world with U.S. power. So the caller is quite right. That's going to have to be squared at some point. Who's on the list? Who's off the list? If you look at the other part of the axis of evil, not just Iraq, North Korea, but Iran, a lot of people look at Iranian terrorism and their ability and what they have done over the years and say that may be the real problem in the world vis-a-vis terrorism.
Washington, D.C. next.
Good day. I think it's more accurate to say the U.S. and Iraq attacked Iran and killed 1 million people from 1980 to 1988, and during the same time the U.S. government spent $800 million in guns, mines, and ammos, killing 1 million people in Somalia. Now, after James Baker restarts the war in Ethiopia in 1991-92, I'm quoting the Washington Post, there's 15 million human beings starving to death. And the American Red Cross, who tried to steal $500 million of victims' funds in public, is saying, please give cash for work. This is word for word Nazism, and promoting these deaths and not talking about them as if it's just, it's Hussein took Kuwait, 1,200 were killed. When Bush took Panama, 15,000 people were killed. So I thank you. I believe you're being led since 1972 around, and you're a sock puppet for these folks, and I think you're paid well to do this. Please report the news. Thank you.
Okay, well, the caller threw around a lot of numbers, not too many of which I think are factual. And it does raise a very interesting question. If you're worried about starving people in North Korea or Iraq, what about some of the places where more people are starving in Africa? And that is, again, another dimension of this that needs to be addressed. This suggestion since 1972, I've been led around. You report these stories. Lots of people didn't like the Watergate coverage, particularly Republicans. When all of the evidence was out, it's probably, in fact, it is the Republicans who were most offended at what Nixon did, and it's the Republicans who really insisted that he resign, is exemplified by Barry Goldwater. In this case of what goes on in the Bush White House, it's critical, in my opinion, to have as detailed a record of exactly what they did and said and the reasons for it. This is 1 year plus into this conflict, the war on terrorism, and as I say as clearly as I can, who knows where it goes after this, but this is the kind of granularity, the kind of Cheney said this, Powell said this, there was a memo here, there was a secret cable there, that you rarely get this soon in an administration. You may get it 20 or 30 years down the road.
With that caller's question and the start of our second hour with you, let's spend a little bit of time learning more about your style of reporting. He raises issues that you've heard many times over the years with the way you approach your subject matters in books. Here's just a recent criticism by Newt Gingrich on this same theme of Bush at war. One can't help feeling, for instance, that the people who collaborated with Mr. Woodward the most fared the best, he says in his review. And later on he says the world for Mr. Woodward is Washington, and the Washington meetings he attended defined his reality.
First of all, I never attended any of these meetings. I don't know where he got the idea. And then he goes on to say that this book is a good bridge between journalism and the histories that will be written down the road at some point. I, in the course of this, was able to talk to everyone to one extent or another involved in the major decisions in this, including the president. Some people I talked to more than others. I would have liked to have talked to people endlessly. I would love to have more details, more documents, and more notes. It is inevitable that the loudest voice in a book like this is the president's. To be able to get him to say why and how he made his decisions tells you exactly what he is doing. What's interesting about it is, as Vice President Cheney said at one point, it's not always pretty. It is a story of some doubt, some hesitation, not so much on Bush's part, but on the part of others. There are bumps in the road. There is immense uncertainty, and the goals, as you suggested, of getting bin Laden, getting all the terrorist leaders have not been achieved. But it's a cross-section of it, and somebody like Newt Gingrich, who was the Speaker of the House, is a very strong conservative Republican, sees a book like this like he sees anything else, through a political lens. And there are people in the Bush administration that he doesn't agree with, and I let him have their point of view. Somebody with the lens from another political perspective is going to look at it and say, no, wait a minute, there's too much of this in it, or there's too much of that. People are going to react differently to it, and that's fine. I have no problem with that. I don't look at it through a political lens. I'm interested in what happened and why.
understanding that this person comes from a similar political lens as Newt Gingrich, it's Tony Blankley. This moves from who gets treated how in your books to how you do your work. He writes in a review in the Washington Times, now his home base, "As I can testify to from firsthand experience, the Woodward method is simplicity itself. He just calls up the various players and their senior staff, tells them what horrible things are being said about them by their co-workers, and then offers them a chance to get their side in."
Well, Tony was Newt Gingrich's press secretary, and I remember going to Tony Blankley, and I think it was the day of the Oklahoma City bombing, and I don't talk that way, and I'm surprised he would say that. What I'm sure I said to him is, which was not news to him, is Newt Gingrich's press secretary. Newt's a controversial figure. I am doing a book at that time on the presidential election of 1996. If you recall, Gingrich and the Republicans took over the House in 1994. There was suspicion at that time that Gingrich would run for president. There was quite serious talk about it, and I went to Blankley to say, I want to talk to Gingrich, I want to talk to you to get your point of view, because it looked, at least at that time, and there was some serious flirtation with it, that Gingrich was going to run. And so you would have a Clinton-Gingrich matchup, which certainly would have been interesting in 1996. But he's distorting the method for, and his memory is not as good as mine.
With regard to the method, the question I heard reverberating around this town the past 3 weeks, really in the bottom line of Tony Blankley's paragraph there, is how does Bob Woodward get this kind of access? Why do people talk to him?
Well, that word gets thrown around, access. Access might be, let me give you a very concrete example, to a colonel I know who works in the military, who gave me a list of National Security Council meetings, and just the dates and the times, and some of the people who attended. That's the first clue I had that there were a whole series of meetings. And we suspected there were, you know, the National Security Council met this day. Some of them are put out by the White House, some are not. This was a comprehensive list. Now, that's not access, that's reporting. Then I would go to somebody and say, okay, this was a critical day, what happened? Well, I'm not sure. Talk to some more people, go back and forth, get somebody who will consult notes or a memo and get part of the story. Go to somebody else, get more. Somebody who has a more complete record, and try to fill it in and build the chronology. It is assembling the building blocks, and it is not waiting for somebody to say, oh, here's somebody who's going to hand it to you or bring it to you in a grocery cart of documents. It doesn't work that way. I have, to answer your question, I have the luxury of time. The Washington Post gives me time to work on these stories, so I can assemble the building blocks. I don't have to write a story the next day.
If you've joined us recently, we're talking for 3 hours this afternoon with Bob Woodward. This is our in-depth monthly series with nonfiction authors. Mr. Woodward's latest book is Bush at War. It's the 12th in his chronicles of the levers of power in Washington, D.C. And last week it was on USA Today's combined fiction and nonfiction list in the #2 slot. Makes him one of America's best-selling nonfiction authors. Next call for him is from Chicago. So first we have Clover City, California. Go ahead.
How you doing, Mr. Woodward? You're a fine journalist. I have a comment and a couple of questions. I understand Mr. Bush is a fundamentalist Christian, and he takes his advice from Billy Graham's son, Jimmy Swaggart, Pat Robertson. And these people are saying very inflammatory things about Islam, the Prophet of Islam, and whatnot. And there's a great book by Karen Armstrong called Holy War, the Crusaders and their impact on today's world. Do you know if Mr. Bush have read this book before?
I don't know the answer to it, and I think you're not correct that he takes his advice from Billy Graham or Jimmy Swaggart. I think President Bush has very deep religious convictions, and at one point when I asked him about his motive on some of these things, he said it might be my religion in part, but I don't think he's taking any advice from Billy Graham, and I think Jimmy Swaggart has kind of been discredited and is off the radar.
Can you talk to the larger point of the caller's question in the president's view of Islam?
He has been very respectful in his statements about Islam, that it is at core a religion of peace. There are a lot of people who argue with this, and there's a debate going on. His view, as he stated repeatedly, and in the days after September 11th, he went to the Islamic Center and praised the religion, and his argument has been that this extremist bin Ladenism, or whatever you might want to call it, is a perversion of Islam.
Chicago, welcome.
Hello, thank you, Mr. Woodward. Since World War II, we've had a pretty poor record of nation building, and my question was, in your period at the White House writing the book, do you sense that there's a cogent plan and a commitment to a plan for a stable post-Saddam Iraq, assuming that we actually go to war?
Good and important question, not just relating to Saddam and Iraq, if that leads to a war, but in Afghanistan. We haven't solved the Afghanistan problem. And interestingly enough, President Bush operates kind of as the chief budget officer or financial officer for Afghanistan, and says that he's regularly asking for an accounting of how much money comes in and how much money goes out. We now see that he has sent the military out on a nation-building enterprise in Afghanistan, something during the campaign he said quite strongly he did not anticipate doing. Again, this is the theme. This is a practical man who will make adjustments with necessity.
As we do with all of our in-depth authors, we took our cameras to the place where you work. I want to show that to our audience and have you talk a little bit about what happens after you have those interviews, you get those recordings. What's next? What's your style? Okay. Where are we visiting, first of all?
This is my home in Washington, where I live with my wife and 6-year-old daughter, Diana.
And how much work do you do here?
Most of my work. In fact, I have a more modern chair now, but at that desk, which is an old door turned over, I think I've written 9 books. And this is a working office, as you can see, dominated by chaos. And the filing system is not as organized as it should be, and it's something I'm going to try to work on in updating. And my assistant, Mark Malseed, has the responsibility now to get me on the track of some sort of way of putting the files, which are paper files going back to Watergate, in some sort of coherent order.
And do you have a pattern to your writing? Do you write at a certain point of the day?
Because, I guess, of my age, I tend to wake up early, 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning when I'm writing, and I will go up here and write, and you can get an awful lot done before 9 o'clock, before the phone starts ringing, or so that's the general pattern. But again, having an office in your home is a great luxury and advantage, because you can go to work when time is available or when the impulse strikes you.
A few years ago when you were on our Book Notes program, Brian Lamb, the host, asked you about what you plan to do with all of those tapes for the archival future. You said at that point you hadn't made any decisions. Are you any thinking any more about that?
Well, I'm thinking about it, and there have been discussions with people, but I'll have to see. There are a lot of very sensitive sources on all of those books. The last book you're showing there is my wife, Elsa Walsh, her book, Divided Lives. Here I'm in my assistant's office, Mark Malseed, who joined me on this book in May.
And is an architecture graduate.
That's right.
Was a surprise to see that.
Yeah, but somebody who just been a wonderful assistant and person to have around the home, endless capacity for work and what I guess is now called multitasking. He can do many simultaneous things, so you can give him 6 things at the beginning of the day, and he'll get them done and then come back with 12 things I need to do.
Come back to that thought on your archives, the tapes. You said there were lots of sensitive sources on it, so...
There are, and there are stories to be told, and I've agreed to promise anonymity to those people who want it, and for my newspaper work and for the books. And it will surprise a lot of people who sources were and the extent to which they talked. During Watergate, the final phases, he's now deceased, but Fred Bazart was Nixon's lawyer. And Carl Bernstein and I interviewed him 17 times for the second Watergate book we did, The Final Days.
So you know you have a treasure trove for history, but you've got to figure out how to do it to protect those who cooperated with you.
Yeah, who are still alive, still in sensitive positions, and we've kept our word. I've kept my word on that, and will continue to.
Altoona, Pennsylvania, welcome.
Hi, Mr. Woodward.
Hi.
I was interested to know your opinion of George Bush selecting Henry Kissinger to head the 9/11 Commission to find out why it happened and why we didn't know about it.
Fascinating choice, and there's been a lot of commentary on it that it's perfect because Kissinger is the ultimate establishment figure, still wants to be part of the action, writes long op-ed pieces, writes fascinating books about things. He will be judged on this, like everything else he's done, the product. And if we look at it through clear eyes, I think his product is mixed during the Nixon administration particularly. And the history is there. I wrote some of it myself. At the same time, there's no one who speaks in paragraphs the way Kissinger does. There's no one who is thoughtful and creative. A number of people have suggested that Kissinger is going to have to do this well because he's not going to want to go out with a fizzle. And there'll be lots of people second-guessing him, including myself.
Missoula, Montana. Go ahead.
Hello, Mr. Woodward. I was wondering, there's been a lot reported on this scorecard that President Bush keeps in the Oval Office on the terrorists.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if you could comment on the terrorists, the check marks that we don't hear about.
That's a great question. President Bush actually showed Dan Baltz, my colleague at the Washington Post, and I this scorecard that he keeps in his office drawer. And it has little pictures of the top 22 terrorists. Now, this was last year, with little biographies. And if one is killed or captured, he puts an X through it. And there was a point last year when they thought Dr. Zawahiri, who was kind of the #2 in the bin Laden organization, had been killed. And Bush showed us this, and there'd been an X through it, but then later reports established that they couldn't conclusively say he'd been killed. So Bush dutifully, like a good scorecard keeper, erased it. but you could see the faint outlines of the initial acts. The caller asks a very good question. Who are the people we don't know about? Thousands of people rounded up, detained, some maybe permanently, somebody questioned and let go, who have terrorist connections. That is going to be one of the stories that emerges in the coming years. Who are these people? Why? Was there justification for detaining and questioning them? What was the quality of information that was available to say, we're going to arrest you? And who made the decision? Who has that authority within our CIA to go to a foreign intelligence service and say, we want so-and-so arrested because we think he's a terrorist? All that's going to come out, all that will be reviewed. It should be examined thoroughly. On the other hand, the fact, the largest fact for me as a journalist and as a citizen that's up on the board, the scorecard that's there in the last 14 months, is there has not been another attack in the United States by bin Laden's organization. Anyone who knows anything about this will say they have the capability, they have sleeper cells in this country, they have known al-Qaeda cells that we are watching, and the fact that they haven't is remarkable. And there are people in the intelligence community and elsewhere who swear they would eat their hat or more if we didn't have an attack after the first year again, and we did not. So part of that is the disruption that has taken place from the arrest and detention of these people abroad.
Doylestown, Pennsylvania, welcome to the program.
Hello, and I appreciate all of both of your hard work. And I had a question about, did you happen to ask President Bush about the conflicts of interest regarding weapons and oil business of the Bush family, the Carlyle Group, or other men in the cabinet, Cheney and Halliburton? And would you examine these connections at a later time? Because I think the whole world is very, very interested.
I think those are very good questions, and I did not ask him. I was interested in the decisions he made as Commander-in-Chief in the war on terrorism. The questions of potential conflicts of interest and who's making money, as another caller suggested, should be subject of further exhaustive inquiry in the future.
Because I pulled two critiques from the conservative side, I thought in the interest of fairness I'd find one kudos from that side. This is Fred Barnes writing in the Weekly Standard his review of your book, but he says, Woodward, famed for his investigative reporting that cracked open the Watergate scandal, is the best pure reporter of his generation, perhaps ever. I see that as a lead-in because you and I were talking before the program that there are no journalists in your family. How did a guy from Illinois get to be someone described as perhaps the best pure reporter of his generation?
I was going to go to law school after serving in the Navy 5 years, and there was a month off, and I tried to get a job at the Washington Post, and they gave me a 2-week tryout, and I failed it, and in that failing realized I loved the work, that it was enjoyable. There's an energy, there's a connection in a newsroom to what's going on in the outer world. And instead of going to law school, I got a job at the weekly paper in Montgomery County, Maryland, called The Sentinel, for $110 a week, I remember. Called my father, who was a judge at the time, and he always expected that I would become a lawyer, I believe, and told him what I was doing. And somebody who truly in personal matters was non-judgmental, he said to me, "You're crazy." And I think he really meant it. And it made no sense to him. It made sense to me because it's great work.
Next call for you is from Manhattan.
Did you say New York?
Yes.
Hi. I was wondering what you think it says about the presidency in general that somebody who knows so little about the outside world or the world outside America can actually become president, you know? And also, did you ask him why Ashcroft would not check the gun records of any of the people held?
Okay, I did not ask him about Ashcroft in checking gun records. I mean, what it says about the country is Bush got elected. Almost a majority of the people voted for him, and he won in the Electoral College. And interestingly enough, he has a self-confidence, but I also sense, and from the deliberations in the thousands of words of National Security Council minutes, I quote, he realizes what he doesn't know, and some of the things he says suggest improve that. For instance, at one point he said, well, can the first bombs in Afghanistan be food?
A couple of questions by email for you. This one goes back to the Watergate story from a viewer named Rusty Casto. When did it first dawn on you and Carl Bernstein that your coverage of Watergate was going to be a big, big story?
It was always an interesting story from day one. It was incremental. We wrote hundreds of stories, and it was always just a little one advancing. Some were bigger than others. In fairness, Carl realized much faster than I the ramifications of this, and at one point said, this guy's going to be impeached. And I, at that point, did not think it was possible.
Again, in reading All the President's Men, you talk about how the two of you first linked up, and there was a bit of competition between the two of you for bylines and who was going to have what role and the like. How did it all work out today? Are the two of you still friends?
We are indeed friends. We talk regularly. He is working on a book on Hillary Clinton, and there was always tension in the Watergate reporting. And it wasn't about bylines, it was about, with us, you know, how good is the evidence? Do we need more sources? Do we have enough detail? And it was always a kind of tension with the editors, who were particularly Bradley, you know, professional skeptics, and would always say, kid, you don't have it. Go back for more. Prove it to me.
How did life change for you, perhaps the two of you, with the Pulitzer Prize and with a very successful Hollywood movie?
I stayed at the Post. Carl went to New York, has written books, worked for ABC Television, worked for Time Magazine, wrote a very wonderful book about the Pope, biography, and I keep kind of one foot in daily journalism. Post has been very generous to me and very kind and flexible, allowing me to pursue the books or pursue something at length. There are time periods I've spent on things that have been unproductive, and that they're willing to swallow that. And for instance, this book on Bush started out to be a book about his first year in office. It was going to be about the tax cut. And I was all set to write it. In fact, I was doing my last interview on 9/11. And it was obvious to dispose of the tax cut book, and I have a wonderful set of files on the tax cut, which may be a very good story for the newspaper or a book or part of a book in the future, because the consequences, potentially, of that tax cut may be very great.
I don't know if these kinds of questions are possible or interest you to answer, but a viewer named Roger Hart wants to know, what is your overall view of Richard Nixon, and how do you think he would have handled the crisis today?
You don't want to get me started on Nixon. I've listened to too many tapes, too familiar with the record. Sadly, he was a criminal president who regularly ordered his aides to do criminal things. A lot of people don't like to hear that, but the record is abundant on that score. How he would have handled this crisis, I don't know. I mean, it is pure speculation. Lots of people have asked, how would Al Gore have handled this crisis? Some people have suggested that it was obvious what to do, and any president would have set us on the course of war that Bush has set us on, that war had been declared against us. Don't know.
And this from John Crossan in Felton, California. Without using Watergate as analogy, would you please justify for us your use of inside sources that give you information that may be considered confidential or sensitive? It has been quipped that you often get this information as soon as your source steps out of the meeting room door. Therefore, are you an investigative writer and reporter that lives under the rule, any means justifies the end?
No. I mean, obviously not any means justifies the end. I like to get information. Some of it may be sensitive, some of it may be confidential. It's going to, if it should jeopardize military or intelligence operations or jeopardize the life of someone, I would not publish it.
Next call is from Seattle.
Thank you. That's the tax refund, I would like to say. Anyway,
tax refund is supposed to tax cut.
That's a refund.
What did you do with yours?
I put it in the rest home for my wife because the illegal aliens are ahead of her as far as her being a citizen. So I would appreciate that this gentleman and anybody that follows him would take care of the citizen before. But anyway, get on into as far as patriotic's concerned. I would like to see someone write a book on with Clinton when he declared that the communist dictator of communist China was a partnership. I'd like to find out how much information he and his cohorts, and Al Gore and all of those that followed Clinton, just how much information was given to them and what it has done to undermine this country. And I would say that is the enemy within. And look back at World War II, Korea, or Vietnam. Who was in charge? It was the Democrats that were in charge. And we, in all those three wars, were undermined. We had no provisions. We had no direction whatsoever to begin with.
So your concern is with U.S.-China relations?
I'm concerned with the patriotic people. When Clinton took on his partnership,
I can see what he's getting at. There were allegations, and some of them continue, about Clinton's connection to China. They were investigated, and nothing really came of it. Does that mean that there isn't more investigation that could be conducted? Certainly it could.
We are halfway through our 3-hour conversation with Bob Woodward. He is here with us today to talk about his body of work and a special emphasis on his brand new book, Bush at War. Ithaca, New York, you're next.
Yes, good afternoon. First of all, I want to thank you very much for being on today. My son is doing he had a question paper to do for his history class, and he's doing it on who was Deep Throat and investigating Watergate. And one question he has always had is, would Watergate have happened if it were not for Deep Throat? Would it have been uncovered? And exactly, do we give too much credit to Deep Throat, or were there other things that were breaking around us that was more or less a matter of the pieces falling into place? And what made you so confident in your in being sure that the information that Deep Throat was giving you was accurate? Thank you.
Okay, well, I hope it helps his son with his paper. By and large, probably too much credit and emphasis is given to Deep Throat. If you look at All the President's Men, you see that was one of the sources, but it was in the context of lots of other sources. And the question about how did I know, or why did I believe it was true? Because it checked out, because there were other sources and other details where it all fit together. The myth of Deep Throat is that he did this all by himself. He did not. And the other myth is that Carl and I did it. What we did is keep the story alive, focus on some of Nixon's aides. Our stories were not about Nixon. They were about Haldeman and Ehrlichman and Mitchell and the people around Nixon and the plotting of the Watergate burglary and other espionage and sabotage operations against the Democrats.
While we're talking about Watergate and the book, here's a clip from John Dean, who participated in a conference that we covered last year. And let's hear him with all these years' perspective on the investigation.
Cracked Watergate, exposed it. It's not true. In fact, about at least 70% of Deep Throat's information that he gave Woodward was dead wrong. The Post did not crack the case. They were never really anywhere close to it. What they did do, though, however, is they kept the pressure on those in Washington who read the Washington Post every morning, the federal judges, the federal prosecutors, members of the House and Senate, where this story could not go away after the '72 election because the Post kept putting it on the front page. And while every little detail became a new headline, it was the only paper in the country that was paying any attention to this story. The story got no traction whatsoever during the 1972 campaign, and but for the Washington Post, the story probably would have disappeared after the election. So while they didn't crack it, they did keep the pressure on and result in it failing of its own weight and falling apart.
Bob Woodward, what do you think?
Well, I'd agree with most of what he said. We did not crack it in terms of Nixon. We did a lot of the reporting about Nixon's aides, as I was saying earlier, and what Dean is saying reflects where he was sitting. He was in charge of the cover-up, and the cover-up was not to protect him or the other people in the Nixon re-election committee or the Nixon White House. It was to protect the president. And we never said the president was involved until the tapes started coming out, until Dean's own testimony fingered the president. So it's a fair comment. Now, people think in terms of Watergate, it had so many phases and parts to it. It went on for over 2 years, from the burglary to Nixon's resignation. To a certain extent, it continues to today, as it's debated, as people think in terms of, as you were asking about, is there a Watergate or a Watergate legacy in the White House of this President Bush? In that 2-year concentrated period of Watergate, 26 months, it was ignored for really the first 6 months, and we were the ones writing the stories. We were the ones raising the questions. At one point, Senator Ervin, who would head the Senate Watergate investigation, which really picked up the ball, called me up to his office, and one of the things he said is, if we can establish the involvement of Jeb Magruder, who was a deputy to John Mitchell in the Nixon re-election committee, we will have done our job. In other words, the bar was very low at that point, and the conventional wisdom in Washington was Nixon's too smart to be involved in this.
Next call for Bob Woodward is from St. Petersburg, Florida.
Mr. Woodward, you're probably one of the most knowledgeable men we have. But my name is Colonel Miller from St. Petersburg, Florida, and I'm retired out of the Army. And I believe you're the only man living can get the Vietnam War straight. Watergate be damned. I'm talking about Richard Nixon as the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, and I postulate that that war was won militarily, but it was lost in the Congress of Washington with president of one party and the Congress from a different party that passed the war powers out.
but that war was won militarily in 1972. You intend to do a book to get the public straight on that?
Well, I mean, it's an interesting question. There's some people who would agree with you. Interestingly enough, I was talking to former President Ford about this a couple of years ago, and he wouldn't entirely agree with the Colonel, but in part he would, and President Ford said, look, the support for the war in Vietnam by 1975 had evaporated. Congress would give it no more money, there was no more public support, and we had no choice but to leave. And he felt and indicated that if there had been that level of public support, that maybe something could have been done militarily. Now, lots of people would argue with that also, but my intention, to answer his question, is to not do a book on that, though they're very legitimate and interesting questions.
28 years and 12 books, and two things that have been consistent: Simon & Schuster as the publisher and Alice Mayhew as your editor. What roles do each have in the final product?
Without them, it couldn't be done. Alice Mayhew edited all the President's Men for Carl and myself, and she's the editor who is tough, what will not let you get overly involved in your material. I remember on one book at one point I'd written 90 pages on something. She said, can you cut it back? I said, to how much? And she said, to 2 pages.
80 or 90 to 2 pages?
To 2 pages. The kind of editor that we all need, somebody who will say and reconsider everything that's written, everything that's examined in this book, Bush at War. After I had talked to President Bush, she came down, Alice came down to, she does not like being talked about, but I'm going to do it anyway if that's okay, because you asked. She came down to Washington, read the transcript, marked where she thought things were interesting, important, and then said maybe we should start the book with you talking to Bush, because he said so many interesting and relevant things on the record. So I drafted it, and she looked at it and she said, no, it does not work there. The issue here is Bush responding on September 11th and then showing day by day, month by month, leading up to the confrontation with Iraq. And then you can go and discuss your interview with him. And she was absolutely right, that you can't make this a story, because there was so much reporting done behind the scenes about what happened. This can't be a story about what Bush says. It's a book about what happened, about the interaction, and then kind of a running commentary that Bush provides at critical points. And that is editing smart, which he has done on all of these books. And in many ways, I could sit here for hours and talk about it.
When we were looking at the video from your house, you told us when we saw your spouse's book on the bookshelf that she's a working journalist as well. Does she assist in any formal way or informal way with your books?
She reads things first after my assistant, and is very, very patient. And at the end of the day, or at bedtime, I may give her 30 or 40 pages and said, can you read this? And of course that's the last thing somebody wants to do, but she will do it. And you had asked about Simon & Schuster.
That's right.
What is important to me about them is they can keep a book confidential, and they can publish it. The turnaround time, the last discussion in this book is in October, and it was published a month later. Normally it takes 4 months, 6 months, 12 months before a book is published. So this is right into the headwinds of the events we are living and discussing now.
So the acceleration is an important thing that they can do.
And that's a lot of coordination, a lot of making sure that the paper is there and the shipping and all of the things I know nothing about that they do perfectly.
Next call for you. By the way, we're speaking about all these personal intersections in your life. We've got some photographs, but we're going to take a couple calls and then we'll look at some photos with you from your life as well. Let's hear next from Iowa City, Iowa. You're on the air.
Hi. Hello, Mr. Woodward.
Hello.
Yes, I've been a great fan of all of your work. I read All the President's Men was the first Watergate book I ever read, and I enjoyed it very much, and it really whetted my interest for the whole field. I'm a young person. I'm 21. Of course, I hadn't been alive during that time, and just reading about it, you really get a taste of what all of history has given us to this moment. It's really helped me understand current events much more. I'm wondering, like, I did watch and live through the impeachment of President Bill Clinton, and I found it was interesting contrasting what I heard about the special prosecutor team that was investigating Clinton versus Jaworski, and before him the other guy who I don't remember his name right now, but
Archibald Cox.
How they were agonizing about whether to prosecute Nixon. The Senate and the House, the people were they discussed what their role was, what their role in history was. They had a very clear idea of how history would view them. And it seems to me that was lacking, at least just from what I've heard, from the Clinton investigation.
Well, a lot of people would agree with you on that there was a difference, and there's been a lot of criticism of Ken Starr and his investigation of Clinton. But if you can pull the camera back a little bit, Clinton brought a lot of that on himself, maybe all of it, and there was always a propensity to not level and tell the full story, and whether you needed the vehicle of an independent counsel, criminal investigation, to expose that or not will be debated in history for a long time. I wrote this book, Shadow, about the legacy of Watergate, and half of it is about Clinton's problems and his impeachment. And one of the things real quickly that comes through in comparing Watergate and Lewinsky-gate, or whatever it might be called, is in the case of Nixon, there was a mountain of evidence that he broke the law. Everyone almost in the end really testified against Nixon or wrote memoirs criticizing him. In the case of Clinton, there was no real compelling evidence that he committed a crime, or at least a crime that the House impeached him for. He clearly lied in one of the depositions, but interestingly enough, the House did not charge him with lying in that civil deposition in the Paula Jones case. Clinton, in a way, learned the lesson of Watergate. Don't trust anyone. Anyone might be a witness against you at any time. To my knowledge, he did not have an automatic taping system, so there is not the witness or the tapes or the documentation to prove criminal activity, where in the case of Nixon, you could prove dozens of crimes.
I think any president would have a taping system after Richard Nixon's White House?
Let's hope not. The idea is repugnant. That, I mean, here's Nixon. One of the things all presidents learn is that people come into the Oval Office and they unburden themselves. It's like all of the defenses are down. And they say things, they reveal things, they break confidences. A cabinet officer will come in and say, Mr. President, you won't believe what this other cabinet officer is doing, or what happens here, and to secretly tape all of that. As Henry Kissinger said, it's madness. It would take 6 or 7 years to listen to it, just once. So Let's hope we don't have it.
Did the same view hold true of Lyndon Johnson taping his phone calls from the White House?
Well, Michael Beschloss in the books on that, on Johnson, has revealed a whole different side to the taping. And you see Johnson operating and manipulating people, and I think because of the crimes of Nixon, people were willing to accept the way Johnson did things, and the tapes to come out so many years after his presidency. Remember, in Nixon's case, the tapes started coming out while he was still president.
Santa Barbara, thanks for waiting. You're on the air.
Thank you. I appreciate you both, and I think Brian Lamb is a gem. 2 questions. One, I guess it's just I'd like your comments on what's going on in the administration in terms of human rights. It seems like Ashcroft is doing all sorts of strange things, and President Bush is taking away, like you mentioned earlier today, the the right to look at papers and things like that for historians. But also he's dealing with the General Accounting Office and going to privatize some of that printing or not allow some of the printing. And I'd just like to hear your comments on that. And if you think Cheney is involved in any of this. And secondly is a tacky question, but it came up on Thanksgiving night. Someone told me that Laura Bush, whom I do like, was involved in a manslaughter vehicle accident when she was younger. Do you know anything about that?
Okay, in the Laura Bush case, I just know that I have read, and I think there was an automobile accident in which somebody died. On the question of is Cheney involved and what's Ashcroft up to and what's happening, I mean, these are all areas that should be investigated and will be investigated. I focused on the war because I think the question of the war on terrorism is the most critical question facing everyone in this country. Should we succeed at it and do well? I think it could be argued the future is bright. If we fail at it, the terrorists could do things to the American way of life that would make the worries about Ashcroft seem tame, and do things to the American economy that we would take many years to recover from.
One reviewer said your new book, Bush at War, could almost have been called Commanders 2 because of the reprise of the cast of characters. Looking at some of the central figures in both books, is there anyone whose leadership style or worldview changed noticeably from the last time you spent time profiling them?
Well, mainly in the Gulf War, excuse me, Cheney and Powell were in their roles. Cheney, Secretary of Defense, and Powell, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs. I think the worldviews are pretty much the same. Powell was the reluctant warrior in the commanders, but somebody who saluted and willingly led the nation to war in the Gulf when there were enough troops there to make sure that we would succeed. Cheney was a very powerful, strong manager of the Pentagon and of that war effort. I think some people now identify Cheney with the hard line, quite rightly. He believes that Iraq poses a threat the likes of which we have never seen, or maybe that's a little extreme, but he really is worried about Saddam Hussein, where Powell is much more interested in the diplomatic route.
Next is Springfield, Virginia.
Can you imagine someone losing their voice after a couple of hours of this?
You only have 1 hour to go.
Okay, good.
I have a question about your sources, particularly when a source might be a public official, and when events are continuing to unravel, like particularly with the Bush at War book. And what sort of checks do you put into place to make sure that potentially a source might be trying to use your book, your reporting, as a way to absolve themselves on particular historical events, particularly on 9/11, and whether it be a cabinet official or some other official within the administration?
That's a very good question, and I check these things as much as I can. And one thing we should not be naive about as citizens, or somebody like myself as a writer, that any time some public official talks to you privately or in public, they are trying to steer and trying to direct and shape the story. When the president gives a press conference, you think he's going out there for any other reason than to try to explain and to put the best light on everything that is going on? The same with any other official. So what you can do as a reporter is go back again and again, look for the contemporaneous records. I was able to get contemporaneous notes so you can see exactly what was said, what the interaction was. But you always have to be a doubter. You always have to be skeptical of it. Going back to Watergate, Carl Bernstein and I developed this notion of the best obtainable version of the truth, which means you can never say it's the truth because you don't know what you don't know. But as reporter, spending as much time as possible and triangulating, trying to get, in some cases, half a dozen sources on specific moments and turning points, it's the best obtainable version at this point.
Have you ever taught any college classes in journalism?
Many times.
And what is it that you want to leave behind for next generations in terms of doing the job well?
Well, the first thing is, if you're working on something, develop multiple sources and check and recheck what I was talking about earlier, even on a day story. Don't think it's a press conference from the police chief and one phone call. It's not enough. Second thing is look for records, look for documents, look for notes, look for calendars, look for transcripts, some sort of documentary foundation for what you're writing about. And I guess the third element would be go to the scene of what you were writing about. Don't just stay in a chair or go there. In this book, I was not able to go to Afghanistan. I asked all kinds of people to let me go to the Situation Room, which is where these meetings take place. It turns out the Situation Room is a special classified facility called a SCIF, which means for Specialized Compartmented Information Facility. And to even go in the room, you have to have a top secret clearance, which I don't have. So I was not able to go into that room and feel the texture of the chairs and the table and the lighting and so forth. I looked at lots of pictures of it, and I print some pictures in the book. But it's always desirable to go to the scene.
Next call for you is from Oakland, California. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Mr. Woodward, thank you for all of your work. I guess the question that I have is, given that, and I'm going to paraphrase and probably do a real bad job of it, but Einstein had said that the problems that we've created today aren't going to be solved with the same level of thinking and action that created them. Given that as a framework of approach, what would you say? I mean, and I'm somebody who's interested in current events and studied in D.C. and spent a little bit of time on the Hill, and don't watch the news anymore, frankly, because I've been turned off to the recipe that they think people are looking for to be interested in it. I'm not interested in what's being reported, particularly on TV anymore.
You ought to tell the people who run the TV stations that, because there are a lot of people who agree with you.
Yeah, and I guess I don't. I think that I share it with other people and maybe create a groundswell that way. But I will take that as a suggestion. My question is, given that there are some, we're hitting a watershed with many issues around human rights, the environment, large issues that are going to have to be dealt with, and we're kind of going to be hitting the wall with them. As a reporter and as somebody who I see in the world, citizens see you and reporters as our main means to knowing what it is that's going on, and our main means to understanding the world and taking part in what it is that we can do to make a difference. What do you see as being vital for that vital communication link to be able to fulfill its role in society? Because at this point it doesn't seem to be doing that, and it doesn't seem that the trend is positive.
Wow, that's lots of paragraphs. First of all, your suggestion that more goes into creating problems than solving them, I'm not sure that's the case. I think sometimes you can create a problem in a flash, and it may take a century or more to unwind some of the problems that we have. In terms of the communication, what interests me in journalism and book writing is to try to get to the bottom of something, to try to explain it as fully as possible. I agree with your criticism, what I think is your criticism of television. It reduces everything to a soundbite, or a minute 30. And the great managing editor at the Washington Post, Howard Simons, I remember once told me when I was struggling with the story, and it was very comforting. He said, "Don't worry, you can't understand a man in an afternoon." I remember going, phew, that's right. You can't, you're not supposed to, you can't understand anything in an afternoon or a series of afternoons or even weeks. And that the more you get into something, the more complicated it is. And if we in the journalism business are just going to be it's going to be drive-by reporting, and we never stop the vehicle long enough to get out and re-examine and talk to people again and think in terms of consequences and meaning. People like this caller are going to say, I don't like the recipe, I don't like the way, I know it's too simple, it's more complicated. And there are newspapers, the Washington Post devotes immense resources and money and newsprint to printing very long series. The excerpts of this book covered pages and pages of the newspaper to try to present something that is not the drive-by approach.
We are at the top of our third hour with Bob Woodward in depth today, and we have time for more calls in this final hour. Because of that, do you need anything more to drink? Your voice is getting a little
maybe
rusty.
A little more.
A little
yes.
water or coffee?
Vodka.
That was a joke. I should tell the audience, yes. But we'll fill up your glass for our final hour. Let's listen to a call from Boston next. You are on the air, Boston. Go ahead.
Hi, Mr. Woodward. You've had such an amazing career, both as an observer and a reporter of Washington. And just sort of playing off your last answer, I'd just like to get your understanding of how official Washington works now as compared to what it was like when you were a young reporter covering Watergate. I mean, what are some of the big changes that you've seen in your times, and what things haven't changed that surprise you?
Well, there aren't that many changes, interestingly enough. I wouldn't emphasize the change part of this, that it's still somewhat the same. If you go to people and you say, look, I need to know what happened here, why it happened, and if you can convince them you're as serious about what they do as they are, that as an outsider you really want to understand that, I've said this, you have to have iron pants, you have to be willing to sit for hours and hours and hours, like you do. 3 hours sitting and kind of trying to draw something out of somebody and put it in context and cover the range of issues. So that's always been the case. There's the human dimension. Can you build relationships of trust with people? And if you can, you're going to get closer to a version of what occurred. If you can't build the relationship of trust, I don't think you will get very far. The other big change, or the real big change, because is that everything is 24-hour cable television, the internet. And when I was working on stories for on 9/11, in the months after 9/11, I can remember a time when I had a story and it was all ready to go in the next day's paper. It was going to be a big headline, and at 6:30 at night, I called Len Downey, the editor, on a cell phone and said, "It's fine, but if you give me one more day, I can make it a lot better. And I've got more information." And most editors would have said, "Well, we're committed, we've got to do it, as long as it's fine, we're running it." Immediately, he said, "Fine, we'll hold it, we'll wait." And there are too many editors around who just want to churn it out, want the most immediate that might be fine, and don't have the patience to kind of say, well, let's take another day and make it better. I think there's so many stories where a reporter or editors, or particularly people on television, say, you know, this isn't ready. We don't really know enough about what we're saying here. Let's wait. Let's talk to people again. Let's come back at it. Let's revisit it. So that pressure for time, I think too many news organizations will succumb to the pressure. And I think we have to, in fact, have editors who say, and this is the key, you know, this is a good story, it's fine, but it's not ready. Let's go back. These are the questions I have. This is what's not answered. You ought to talk to so-and-so again. You need to figure out this angle, and so forth.
We're going to do that for promised photo gallery that we have, and your water's ready for you if you'd like.
Great.
Who are we seeing on screen right now?
This is my wife, Elsa Walsh, and our daughter, Diana, who she was 1 or 2 in this. And in this picture, it's with my father on the left and Diana in the middle, and myself vacationing in Michigan near my father's house there.
Did you give, well, we'll continue here. Go ahead.
And this is a picture of my father, lawyer, retired appellate judge from Illinois.
And if we have another one in the queue. All right, let's come back to photos.
That's a picture when he was younger. This is a picture of my mother who died 12 years ago.
And how many siblings do you have in the family?
Well, it's a mixed-up family, a brother, a sister, a half-sister, 4 stepsisters, and 2 stepbrothers.
That's a lot of folks.
Yeah.
And any of them in law, which you were going into?
No.
And no one else went into reporting?
Well, the young girl here, my first daughter, Tally, who's now 26, lives in San Francisco and is a reporter for the Bay Guardian there. And this picture was taken 25 years ago, 26 years ago.
And why don't we make this one the last, please, and we'll come back to
this is Tally now.
Okay.
At age, I think she was 24, 25 here in this picture.
And when she came to you and said, I want to be a reporter?
I tried to find a way to neither encourage her or discourage her.
And what kind of reporting does she do?
It's a small staff, and so she does lots of education, health, politics.
And your younger daughter, Diana, is now how old?
She's 6, and she's in K1 class at Sidwell Friends School.
Personal question, and if too much so, we'll move on, but as parents of a 6-year-old, when you got into those meetings and conversations and learned the extent to which targets in Washington were on the assessment list by the planners at the White House, understanding the threat, did you give any thought as a parent to living here?
Yes. And that's not too personal a question. We live in a high-threat environment, certainly in Washington, certainly in many places in the country, and I worried about it a great deal, and I think you have to face the question of how big is that threat, and is it worth it? And Elsa and I debated it. Frankly, I think we never resolved it, kind of time resolved it, and it may be one of the problems that we've all become numb. As President Bush said, we're all on alert fatigue. There's all these alerts, and people wonder, how serious is it? When is it coming? Is it real? Based on my reporting, I would say no idea when it's coming, but one thing that can be said for sure is it's real.
Next call, Highland Park, Illinois.
Yes, Mr. Woodward, first and foremost, thank you for being you. 2 questions. I'm reading Monk's biography of Bertrand Russell, in which Russell is quoted as saying that the real joy is not solving the problem, but rather raising the question. And I'm wondering if you comment on that. And secondly, to what extent, if any, did the movie All the President's Men accurately portray your relationship with Carl Bernstein?
First, the movie accurately portrayed everything. It not only captured the relationship between Carl and myself, which was tense and competitive but reinforcing, captured the feel of a newsroom quite accurately. Working on a story like Watergate, where you don't have tape recordings or documents and you can't prove things, by getting witnesses to stand up, that it's really, you go home, as Ben Bradley, the editor, said, with a lump in your tummy regularly. The Bertrand Russell question or quote is a very good one. That's what you do as a journalist. You raise questions and people give answers and you put them together, but in a very real sense, you don't get the solution to questions. You get the various answers and you try to tell the story that way, but you always wonder. I could sit here for too long telling you about the stories I never got even an adequate answer to.
Yorkville, Illinois.
Hi, Bob. Thanks
Hi.
for the opportunity to speak with you today.
Thank you.
I just had a couple simple questions for you. Regarding the potential war with Iraq, I guess my first question is, why should America fear Iraq? And even, if Saddam Hussein had, 1 nuclear bomb, I guess George Bush seems obsessed with and very driven toward pursue Saddam Hussein.
Okay, can I answer that question, because that's a really important question. I want to spend a moment on it because it really is on the agenda now. What's going to happen with Iraq and where are we going, and why has the Bush administration turned its attention to Iraq? The first answer is, if you look at what goes on in the War Council meetings after 9/11, 9/11 was a body blow. It was a shock to the whole country, to Bush and his national security advisors. No, I mean, the idea, if you can go back to your own personal emotions, what you felt on that day and during that period, it's very intense. And their adopted goal is prevent the next 9/11. They look around and they say, what is the lesson of what happened? And the lesson is take care of threats early. Don't postpone it, as to a certain extent everyone did with bin Laden. No one did enough. People who did the most were the CIA, and they didn't eliminate him. And so everyone should have done more. So if you're going to take care of threats early, you look around the world and you say, where's that threat? And Iraq comes to the top of the list. And it's not just a nuke that Saddam might have, but the biological and chemical weapons that he allegedly has, that the weapons inspectors are now looking for. And it's a real problem. If you take the most dovish intelligence analyst and say, do you agree Saddam Hussein in Iraq are a threat? I think they'll almost all say, yes, he's a threat. The question is when and to what extent. And that's a very legitimate debate. And interestingly enough, as the weapons inspectors go in and do their job, we're going to get some answers to that. Maybe not some complete ones, maybe not some satisfactory ones. But that's the answer to that critical question about Iraq.
Ogden, Utah. Good afternoon.
Yes, how you doing? I thank you for taking my call. And with your knowledge of Bush and all, I was just wondering if you know anything about the Skull and Bones Society. There seems to be coming a lot of rich and powerful men out of these societies. I was just wondering if there's anybody within the Intel, CIA, or whatever, are they investigating these societies? I mean, there's a lot of talk about it. Nobody's, seems to be a joke, but I'm just wondering, maybe you might have some
Okay, well, it's a fair question. The Skull and Bones Senior Society at Yale, I went to Yale and was in a different one, and they're boys clubs. Or back in the 60s, they were boys clubs before women came to Yale. Now it's boys and girls clubs, and they're a little bit more intense, but I don't think there's any evidence that I've seen that there is a conspiracy or that people are operating in a way that they should. It builds some bonds with individuals that go beyond just, say, being in a fraternity. And I have friends who I was in a society with. One is a senator from Florida now, somebody I feel a closeness to because we shared lots of experiences which were personal and academic during our last year in college. But when Bush's father was running for president in 1988, another reporter and I, Walter Pincus at the Post, spent a long time examining Bush Sr., who was also in Skull and Bones, and I actually interviewed everyone that Bush Sr. was in Skull and Bones with about Bush Sr., and it was kind of interesting and emotional, absent conspiracy as best I can tell.
If you look across the 12 books, the one that stands out for its differentness is this portrait of John Belushi, published in 1984. Why did this subject interest you? How did this story come to you?
I was raised in a town outside of Chicago called Wheaton, Illinois, and Belushi was raised in that town, and so was his wife, who was his widow after he died, and she came to me and said, would you investigate what happened to John? And I did. The widow and Belushi's friends in Hollywood in the entertainment business hated that book because it showed that, in a sense, the whole culture and some individuals were drug enablers, and they made it possible for Belushi to obtain drugs, use drugs, and in a sense, even in some cases, encouraged it. And so it's a very sad story of somebody with immense talent, and I guess in many ways it's a story of the failure of success. He succeeded so well and then destroyed himself. And it's the book I get the most reaction to or mail, even now, almost 20 years later, because people will read it and say, I'm living chapter 36, and I see that you die in chapter 40. And it's a very grim tale of the destruction of somebody through drugs.
A viewer named Jeff DiCello wants to know about this book. Please comment on recent statements by Jim Belushi that he regrets giving Mr. Woodward permission to write about his brother John in the book Wired.
Well, Jimmy Belushi was very angry and still maintains his anger about the book, which was an accurate portrait of what happened, and I'm sorry he feels that way, but I was going to write about it anyway. I think what he's saying is he regrets granting me interviews, which he did.
Toledo, good afternoon to you.
Yes, Mr. Woodward, it's an honor to be able to talk to you. Two questions. One, Watergate, the burglary itself, that wasn't the story. It was a cover-up, wasn't it?
Yes.
That was a story to see how high up it went, and you kept getting blocked on getting information.
Yeah, it wasn't just the cover-up. It was what were they covering up, and essentially they were covering up all kinds of illegal activities in addition to the Watergate burglary. Ultimately, I think now we know what they were covering up is who Richard Nixon really was.
Okay, and the other one is the one caller asked about it before, is that what you hear on the news isn't exactly what the people are saying, because I'll sit down and I'll watch like a speech by President Bush, and then these commentators, they come on and they start commenting on it, and I'm going, did they listen to the same speech I listened to, or, you know, am I losing it here? And I just wonder if you'd comment about that.
Well, I don't find that. I mean, what happens is sometimes somebody, the president or Tom Daschle or somebody will give a speech, and it's the nature of the soundbite journalism. They will take one soundbite out and say this is what the speech was about, and sometimes they're right, sometimes they're wrong, and sometimes speech in its totality will give you a different impression than just one or two sentences from it.
In your personal meetings with George W. Bush, how can you tell our audience ways that he is different from what we see projected through the television lens?
What I found about President Bush, I interviewed him down at his ranch in August. He was on vacation. Many people who worked for him said, get him on vacation, and so we sat for 2 hours and 25 minutes and uninterrupted, focused, interested in the process of somebody trying to find out about why he did things and where it came from and the reactions he had. There was no sense that he was not paying 100% attention to the questions. Now, the questions were not general. The questions would be, Condi Rice came in with this report. What was your reaction? This city in Afghanistan had fallen. What did you think? What did it mean? This is what you said at the NSC meeting. What was your reaction to what Cheney said? Why did you do that? Why did you say that? So I asked all kinds of very short questions about motive and where ideas came from. Is that different than what you get on television? I don't know. I mean, it was an unusually focused morning. He took me on a tour on the ranch afterwards of his ranch and drove all around and could not stop talking about Iraq. Had not decided about what to do with Iraq at that point, and said a couple of interesting things about the Iraq debate, or the Iraq puzzle, as I call it. He said he had to be careful and patient, and said something that I think is critical. He said a president always wants to see or wants to see a successful military plan. Not just a plan, but one that would be successful.
Your colleague at the Post, Howard Kurtz, reported that you earned a nickname from the president, as he often does with reporters he works with regularly. You're Woody to him. My question goes to how do you remain dispassionate in the face of a politician that you might like?
He did give me that name when I encountered him earlier in his presidency, and he mentioned it when I interviewed him a second time. Down in the ranch, there was no Woody. There was no
more formal
sense. It was. I mean, he understands. As I think his biggest critic, maybe not his biggest critic, but most critics would acknowledge he understands the seriousness of his task. And one of his tasks is explaining what he's doing. One of the points he made is, he said he has to speak, he said, I have to speak clearly to the American people, and made the point as a lot of people acknowledge that he's not speaking clearly, or claim he's not speaking clearly, and that he needs to be very clear about what he's doing and why.
Next call, Pacific City, Oregon. Good afternoon.
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you, Mr. Woodward. Mr. Woodward, I have three quick questions. Not all of them relate to each other, but the first one is that you spent a lot of time with talking about President Bush and talking to others about President Bush and talking to President Bush himself. You know, what were your personal feelings about him? Is he the kind of guy you'd like to go fishing with? Number two, did he communicate his answers well to you? There's been real criticism in his diction and et cetera. And number three, this is a little off the subject and different question. Do you feel it is a disadvantage for the American people to have most reporters in our country belonging to the same political party? Thank you very much, sir.
Okay, maybe did you write down?
I did.
I mean, the first question about my personal feelings. I learned a long time ago to take personal feelings and put them in my back pocket and keep them there, because it does not help me in trying to get information. Is he the sort of person I'd like to go fishing with? Sure, because then I could talk to him. He, as I've said earlier, there was something about him not hiding. I've seen his father, when he was president, would not let me within 1,000 yards of him, would never sit for an interview in all the books or the stories I did about him. There's something about this president where in these circumstances, on this issue, he was not hiding. That's very important. And the third question was?
Oh, well, the second one was his style of communications versus the criticism.
That's a very good question. What he does, and I did not recognize this until I read the transcript a number of times of the long interview, he starts his sentences and then pulls back and restarts them, sometimes more directly on point. So if you read it in a transcript or you even hear it, you kind of it's not Kissinger speaking in paragraphs. President Bush speaks in phrases. But if you listen to it and examine exactly what he's saying, it's clear what he is saying. It is not the most coherent sentence after sentence after sentence. It's a series of phrases, and he frequently will restart sentences to the benefit of the sentence, because he will start off in a direction that is not quite on point. But there's no question what he thinks or where he's coming from, and he told lots of stories that he just has never told before about learning, for instance, the importance of access. When his dad was vice president running for president, there was a point at which he said he would be over visiting his dad at the vice president's residence, and the campaign team would come. And he'd be there with his dad for a long time before the meeting, and everyone assumed they were talking about the campaign, In fact, he might have been talking about a sibling or the baseball scores or the pennant race. And because he had that access to his father, that made him important. So he then, when he set up his White House staff, allows a group of people to have access to him, quite frankly, because it gives them power or perceived power, and it also gives them job satisfaction, he said.
One of our viewers was not happy about the answer you gave on Henry Kissinger heading the commission. He writes, "I can't believe your cop-out answer on Kissinger. You know as well as I do about Kissinger's part in lying about Laos, the overthrow of a democratically elected government in Chile, and having knowledge of the creation of the plumbers. Kissinger is a known liar. It's an insult to put him in charge of the 9/11 Commission. Are you sure you haven't become part of the status quo in Washington?"
Well, I've written some pretty harsh things about Henry Kissinger, and the record stands. He's never been indicted. He's never been charged with a crime, to my knowledge, and he is somebody with, as I said, a deeply mixed record. But he'll be judged on the outcome on this. Kissinger is a polarizing figure. There are lots of people who agree with that viewer. There are a lot of people who think he was a genius in foreign policy. So I'll stand on what I wrote about him, and he will be judged in this instance by how he performs. And as I said earlier, there are going to be all kinds of people second-guessing him.
We have 30 minutes left in our 3-hour conversation with Bob Woodward, the man who told us that over the years he's developed iron pants, and we're glad for that this afternoon. Next call is from Kansas City, Missouri.
Hello?
You're on the air.
Yes, I had two questions. The first one has to do with the possibility of a war with Iraq. Is it your impression that President Bush and his top advisors have really thought through what the repercussions of a war would be? I just heard yesterday on TV that the only thing that might be more frightening than having Saddam as the leader of Iraq is not having Saddam as the leader of Iraq. And then second, I have a question about whether or not you think there is a story behind Bush as a member of the board of Harkin Oil. It came out last fall that, and I think it came out during the presidential election, that he's been misleading about his reports to the SEC, and he, maybe even worse, used insider information to help him sell stock at a time when he knew that the company was failing. And yet no one seems to investigate that. It seemed to me that when President Clinton was president, that nothing could happen that didn't lead to a major investigation. So those are my two questions. Thank you.
First, about Harkin, there has been a lot of investigative work on that done. Not all the questions have been answered by any means. It's something worth looking at. Before Bush was running for president, I spent a long time looking at his oil business and what he did, and I could not find anything that suggested anything unethical or criminal. No, there have been serious questions raised about that, and people should continue to look at it, as I am sure they will. And the question of war with Iraq, a more immediate issue, the simple answer to the question is the administration has looked at the consequences of war. Powell helped Bush a lot in dinner that I outline in this book, going through the consequences and the difficulties of going to war alone. And quite frankly, I think they're still debating it. I think the issues are out there. Is the weapons inspectors are in Iraq, what sort of evidence we're going to get, what is going to satisfy people. One impression I had is that President Bush will be more than willing to pull the trigger if necessary. If he determines that the only way to get Saddam out or solve the problems of the weapons of mass destruction that Iraq has is war, he is willing to go to war.
Next call is from West Fork, Arkansas.
Hello?
Yes, sir. You're on the air.
Yes, Mr. Woodward, I have one question. In your interview with President, well, actually two questions. In your interviewing with President Bush, did he at any time mention why he allowed the Osama bin Laden family to fly out of the country? And
no.
Have the subject was never brought up?
No, it was not. And, you know, it's a very big family. And there are all kinds of offshoots and so forth. And some of these people were in the United States. And as I understand it, Saudi Arabia provided an aircraft for them to leave the country essentially for their own protection. But proceed.
Actually, he's not on the line anymore.
Oh.
One of our email viewers has asked a question about a book we haven't talked about yet, The Brethren. But it's Dan Brookhammer of Davenport, Iowa, who wants to know, the Supreme Court tries to maintain an image of an organization that is above political influence. Your book on the court implies differently, he says.
It does. And this is the Warren Burger Court during the period 1969 to 1976. And what the book shows is that the making of judicial opinions is often involves a lot of arm twisting and a lot of fighting, and that there was a lot of personal hostility on the court during this period. Now, the papers of Justice Douglas, Brennan, Marshall are available in the Library of Congress, and I've looked at some of those papers, and other people have, and it turns out that Scott Armstrong and I got one thing wrong in The Brethren, and that is that we understated the degree of animosity and contempt a number of justices felt toward Chief Justice Burger.
Do you go back, you've described your books earlier as that place between daily journalism and history. Do you go back once books are published and the years have ensued and papers are open to check how you did with most of these books?
Certainly, for the newspaper, or in the case of Shadow, but the legacy of Watergate, I went back and looked at the presidencies of Ford, Carter, Reagan, the first President Bush, and Clinton.
Next telephone call for you is from San Francisco. Go ahead.
Yes, hello, Mr. Woodward.
Hello.
Is the current George W. Bush's drive for Baghdad, can it be conceived anyway as his vindication of the failure of his father's administration to finish that job off?
Yeah, that's a good question and is asked regularly by people. I found no evidence of that, and I guess the best evidence on the other side is that President Bush, former President Bush, Bush Sr., feels he did the right thing in the Gulf War. If you may recall, the UN resolutions called for the U.S. military and the coalition forces to drive Saddam and his army out of Kuwait, which had been occupied. And that was the extent of the resolution. The resolution did not authorize going to Baghdad, overthrowing the regime. So Bush Sr. felt he did the right thing. The feeling at the time was that Saddam Hussein was finished, that some colonel or general would go shoot him, or there would be a coup. Of course, that turns out to have been absolutely wrong. And also in my reporting, I found out that this President Bush feels his father did the right thing back in the Gulf War. So it would be vindication for something that they don't feel they need vindication on. Now, other people disagree with that, including some members of the current President Bush's administration.
Here's a completely different kind of question for you from a viewer named Pat Thompson. Mr. Woodward, what are some of your favorite books, and are you a book collector? If so, please tell us a little bit about your collection.
Oh, that's a good question. So many books are our favorites. I'm just finishing Scott Turow's book, Reversible Errors, his legal thrillers. I've always enjoyed immensely. I'm also reading a book, a biography by John Stacks about Scotty Reston, the New York Times. columnist. In terms of collecting books, what I try to do is whenever there's a book, a memoir that comes out about any of the presidents that I've tried to write about, going back to Nixon, I will buy the book and read it or read some of it and make sure it goes into my library, so I have most of the books that have been written, or the major memoirs or historical accounts of each of these presidencies.
Next, Plantation, Florida. Good afternoon. You're on the air.
Hello?
Yes, sir.
Hello.
Hello, this is Pat Wyndham from Plantation, Florida. I'm also a Yalie. I was over at Sterling Hall during World War II helping to make the world safe for democracy by studying radio. I did not belong to a secret society, however. Now, the question is, why don't we forget the Middle East to some extent and move in the direction of sustainable energy resources in the form of hydrogen economy, as espoused by Jeremy Rifkin and Lester Brown and others, and get some information out on that rather than to fight wars over the rather minuscule amount of energy that will be coming out of the Middle East.
Thank you.
Of course, it's not a minuscule amount of energy that comes out of the Middle East, and we import half of our oil, and there is this issue of energy dependence, which we have, and no one has quite faced up to it, simply because the cheapest way to do it is to do it the way we've been doing it, and the risk to the American economy is there for people to see, but no one has been willing to take the steps, which would be immensely expensive, to make us less dependent on foreign oil.
Debbie McLeod in Tampa, Florida wants to go back to the Vietnam period. I'm reading Daniel Ellsberg's book, Secrets, about the release of the Pentagon Papers. Please ask Mr. Woodward if he remembers that period in time and how he and other journalists felt about what was in the papers and what the government of 5 presidents had been telling the press about Vietnam. She says it must have been an extraordinary moment in history.
It was. I was working for a weekly paper in Montgomery County at this time. I think it was June 1971 when the Pentagon Papers were first published, and it was a shock, and quite frankly, part of my reason for wanting to go examine Bush at war and what's going on in the war on terrorism is the knowledge that in the 60s, when the war was beginning, the public was not being told what was going on at the secret meetings, was not being told what the president was really doing. The president was not sitting for hours and hours of interviews about why he did it, what his motive was, whether he had any doubt. By the way, this President Bush, when pressed on, do you have any doubt, insists flatly, categorically, has no doubt that he's on the right course. I asked everyone, I looked hard to see if there was any glimmer of doubt. Don't see it. Now, doubt may not be the problem here. It may be overconfidence in what we're doing. But on the issue of doubt, I satisfied myself as a reporter that it's not there, but that we need to see how and why this policy, these series of policies are made. In the case of the Pentagon Papers, they were just memos and documents. It didn't really tell you what was going on inside the War Cabinet. We now know some of it, at least from Lyndon Johnson's phone calls that were taped, and you see that he had this, he was not telling the public what was going on in the nature of his doubt. So, quite honestly, part of my motive in this is people, the issue of war is the most important undertaking for a country. It tells us who we are and what our values are. It tells the world who we are, and it tells, in a sense, ourselves who we are, what we care about, what we're doing, why we're doing things, why we're undertaking the exportation of death and violence to other people in a country. And so how war policy is made is critical. And for me, the legacy of Vietnam hung very large over this undertaking.
Since you've been explicit about the interviews that President Bush granted you, will you tell us whether or not Colin Powell sat for interviews?
What my deal with everyone, other than the president who spoke on the record, is I would not say who I talked to and who I didn't talk to. In the course of the reporting on this for the newspaper, for a series Dan Baltz and I did on the first 10 days, and this book, I was able to talk to everyone I wanted to and all of the key people. I would have liked to have talked to all of them more.
I'm trying to formulate this into a question which will probably come out a little awkwardly, but looking back to the commanders also, Colin Powell talked to you then, or are you not able to say?
He was a central figure in his memoirs. He acknowledged that he talked to me at length.
All right, then here's where I'm trying to go with this. Colin Powell's willingness to put forward his thinking on the record with you versus the kind of ship he ran with regards to reporter access to the battlefront in the Persian Gulf War. All the reporters there complaining about not being able to get out into the field, controlled access, information through press briefings, that sort of thing. Well, can you take that sloppy question and
It's not a sloppy question, no. I mean, there is a contradiction. And I think the Pentagon then, and I think the Pentagon now, has made a mistake in curtailing access to the battlefield. I think they should find a way to do it. I think reporters can be trusted more than they like to think they can be trusted, and it's to their advantage that the public know exactly what's going on in as much detail as possible. And it's a kind of reflexive reaction on the part of the military, remembering Vietnam, knowing that one false leak or one leak could jeopardize lives, knowing that mistakes will be publicized, perhaps maybe even televised, makes people secretive about their operations. I think it's a mistake. I think they should find a way to find the people who can be trusted and let them see the war up close, or as up close as possible.
Coming down to the home stretch with Bob Woodward, let's take our next call from San Francisco. Go ahead.
Hello?
Yes.
Hello?
We can hear you, sir. Go ahead.
Hello, Mr. Woodward. In 1985, you co-authored an article at the Washington Post about a car bombing that President Reagan ordered in Beirut of a mosque, and Reagan was targeting a leader of Hamas who wasn't there, but 90 women and children were killed and many more injured, and it evidently was understood that President Reagan had done this by members of Hamas who later retaliated, reportedly, with the bombing of the Marine barracks in Beirut. And then about a month later... Okay,
I mean, there's so many things you've got wrong on that. I just need to address them while they're in my mind. This was 1985. It was not President Reagan who ordered it. It was CIA director independently working off the books with the Saudis in an intelligence operation to attempt to kill Sheikh Fidlallah, the head of the Party of God, in Beirut. It did not kill a sheikh. It killed about 80 or 90 civilians, bystanders. And I did write about this, and I did write in the book, but the idea that the Marine barracks bombing, which was at the end of 1983, was a retaliation, would have been impossible because that had occurred 2 years earlier. Anyway, proceed. I'm sorry. There are just too many things you've got wrong there.
You still there?
He's gone?
And no, I'm here. I'm
Yeah.
still here. So about a month later, you were compelled to retract that story, and I'm wondering why that happened, and especially considering what you just said.
It was never retracted at all. In fact, it was reprinted with more detail in my CIA book, Veil.
Back in 1999, Jake Tapper, and this is more for the audience in some ways than for you, just to see what it's like with one of your books when it comes out in Washington. Jake Tapper, writing in Salon, said about Shadow, it had followed the typical post-Woodward book release script. 1, book hit stands and Washington Post excerpts it. 2, reporters regurgitate the most titillating tidbits, usually missing the point of the tome's larger thesis. 3, Woodward's sourcing is questioned, either for anonymity or for single sourcing or for the supposedly unvetted hidden agendas of his informants. 4, the book becomes a bestseller. 5, years later, after the administration in question has ended or key players have died, Woodward's accounts are verified. We've just gone through most of that again. You look like you want to say something.
You know, there is no question when you were going into using sources you're not going to identify, you're writing in an area that I call contested ground. These are very important issues. Did Cheney do this? Did Powell do that? Did the CIA do this? What about Rumsfeld? What about Condi Rice? What about the president? And that's reasonable. It's carefully done, but as a wise reviewer of one of my books once said, these are not engineering drawings. They can't include everything. They don't include everything. There's no way you come close to knowing everything. But there is a careful effort to get the shape of the building and the shape of the rooms and who's in there and exactly what they're doing and attempting to do.
On point number 1 about the Washington Post excerpting it, Michael Gettler, who is the ombudsman for the Post, as you well know, and who describes himself as a friend and colleague of some 30 years, said those readers who have contacted me about the Woodward series complained almost exclusively about what they view as the unseemly promotion of Woodward and the book by the Post. Do you have any comments on that?
You know, it's reasonable, and it looks like perhaps to somebody who doesn't know the arrangement I have with the Post is promotion. What it is, it's news. It's accepted as news, and it has, I've done all of these books, and this book may have more new information in it, explaining exactly what happened at the key moments than any of the books. So if I was not doing the book, there probably would have been many more parts to this story in the Washington Post. But it's one of the things that happens.
For those who don't live in the Post area, here's what the beginning of the 3-part series looked like on the front page of the Post on November 17th. Next call for Bob Woodward is from Lyndhurst, New Jersey.
Hi, I'm on the air, right?
Yes, you are. Welcome.
Okay, hi. The first thing I wanted to say, I want to make a couple comments, and then I have a question. I'm really thrilled to be speaking with you. I'm an admirer of you from a long time, and I remember avidly following the Watergate investigative writings that you put down. I really think you and Bernstein did a great service to this country by not giving up and being so thorough. So I want to thank you for that. And the comment I have is, earlier I heard you say that it was quite a shock to the administration when 9/11 happened. Was it a shock? Do you think it was, first of all, do you feel it was a shock that it happened or the horror of it? Because my feeling, when I live right outside of New York City, and I was very shocked and horrified by it, but I wasn't shocked that it happened. After all, the World Trade Center had been bombed earlier in the decade. And I also vividly remember a speech by Bill Clinton at the UN, I think it was around 1998, it was in the late 90s, warning us about terrorism. And so when it did happen, I wasn't surprised. And I've heard several people say that the administration was shocked by it. And what I'm wondering is, do you think if that's true, do you think that there's some sort of, I mean, I know it was upsetting to them when they lost to Bill Clinton in 1992. Do you think there was some kind of mindset by some of the people in administration that they didn't take some of the things that were passed on from the Clinton administration seriously?
Thank you. We have to go because our time's running out.
Okay. I mean, some things were passed on by the Clinton administration, as I talked about the CIA director warning Bush that bin Laden was an immediate and serious threat. But I'm not sure, you know, the questioner says, shocked by the magnitude of it and that it happened. Well, it's very difficult to separate the magnitude from the it. What happened was, if it had just been 10 people killed or another incident at the World Trade Center, the magnitude is connected in a way. And my feeling, and I've said this before, I don't think Clinton did enough. I don't think Bush did enough. I don't think the press did enough on terrorism. I particularly, having written about terrorism for 20 years, feel that I did not do enough. I totally dropped the ball, should have realized how significant this is. When I heard about bin Laden and read about him before 9/11, I kind of, quite frankly, thought he's kind of a marginal kook figure who really is not a threat to this country. I was dead wrong, and I should have done more. And I'm happy and embarrassed I'm happy to say I should have done more, and I'm embarrassed by it. It was a major force gathering in the world that turned its attention and incredible capacity to kill thousands of people on this country, and a reporter like myself should have been much more alert and focused on the subject.
About 3 minutes left. We're going to try to get in 2 calls. Memphis, Tennessee. First, I'm sorry, Eugene, Oregon. Go ahead.
Yes, Mr. Woodward. I'd like to get your personal observations, maybe even some specific observations on a contentious issue regarding coverage of Israel-Palestine. Both sides seem to believe that the American media is slanted towards the other side. And I was wondering if you had any observations on this matter.
I really don't, and to get into, you know, that's another 6-hour program all by itself.
Memphis, Tennessee.
Hi. Such a pleasure to speak with you. I'm a school teacher. You've been influencing me since I was a teenager. And I want you to know that my students every year have to choose a bestseller to read and write a review of, and you're right at the top of the list. I have a lot of 14-year-olds and 15-year-olds reading you. Now I've got a question that probably is not very pleasant. I read a lot of foreign press and reviews, and I found it very interesting that some of the foreign press and the reviewers are saying that Bob Woodward has gone soft. I don't know what they expected in your book, but evidently you did not give to them what they thought they were going to get. I would like you to make a comment about that, if you would.
Okay, that is a fair comment. What you have to do as a reporter is be able to look at the evidence and weigh it and present it. And I don't go at these stories one way or another. I didn't know exactly what it was going to show. In fact, I'm not sure now what it does show, except what occurred. And some people react to it and say it gives them much more confidence in President Bush and his team. Other people have said it's pretty clear they're not sure what to do, and that there is a lot of doubt, and that there is tension so great within the war cabinet that now has been laid out that you could almost cut it, slice it, and box it. So people will make their comments, and I kind of consider them all fair.
If you haven't yet seen it, this is the cover of Bob Woodward's latest book about Washington. It is called Bush at War, and it is available at any of your favorite booksellers. Mr. Woodward, thank you very much for spending 3 hours with us.